Hey guys, tonight we're going on a little trip, but don't worry, it's purely in your mind, which is good because if we were actually going where we're headed, you'd probably need about 20 vaccines, a guide who knows exactly where not to step, and a really strong clothes peg for your nose. We're traveling deep into the heart of West Africa to the ancient city of Kano, Nigeria, and specifically to a place that smells like history fermented, the old dye pits. It's a world steeped in color tradition and the quiet, back-breaking work of generations. It's less glamorous than, say, ancient Roman gladiators, and definitely smellier than an Egyptian pharaoh's tomb, though those can get pretty ripe too, I guess. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop your location and the time in the comments. It's always cool to see how far these sleepy history stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, so picture this. You're here. Not here. Here, obviously you're tucked up wherever you are, maybe drifting off already, but in your mind's eye, you've just arrived in Kano. Not the sleek, bustling modern city with its cars and noise, but the ancient heart, the old walled city, a place where time moves differently. You step through one of the massive gates built from sun-baked mud bricks, walls so thick and high, they feel like they could hold back the very sands of the Sahara. The air hits you first. It's thick, dry from the north, but carrying 1,000 different scents. Dust, yes, definitely dust, but also spices, roasting meat from a street vendor, the faint underlying whiff of livestock, and something else. Something earthy, a little pungent, maybe slightly sweet. It's hard to place at first, but it's distinct. You follow the narrow winding paths, more like alleys really, between buildings, pressed shoulder to shoulder. They're also made of mud brick, often rendered smooth and reddish-brown sometimes, with intricate geometric patterns carved into the surface. The sun is high beating down, and the shade here in the tight spaces is a welcome relief, though it feels muggy like the heat is trapped. Sounds echo oddly. Snippets of conversation in Hausa, the distant bleating of a goat, the rhythmic hammering of a craftsman somewhere unseen. You pass stalls piled high with vibrant fabrics, gleaming metalwork, intricate leather goods. This city has been a hub of trade for centuries, sitting right at the crossroads of trans-Saharan routes, a place where caravans loaded with gold slaves and ivory would converge, exchanging goods for salt cola nuts and the incredible textiles produced here. As you wander deeper, the general market hubbub starts to soften, slightly replaced by a different kind of atmosphere. You notice the ground changing under your feet. It becomes a little darker, maybe slightly damp in places, even under the relentless sun. And that smell, it's getting stronger now, more distinct. It's not unpleasant in a gross way, not like rotting garbage or anything, though you might catch a whiff of that too. It's an old city after all, but it's industrial, organic both. Then you see them, spread out in a clearing, not in a neat, organized grid you might expect from a modern factory, but clustered together, organic-looking like giant, colorful ancient wells sunk into the earth. These are the dye pits. They aren't pits in the sense of deep holes you might fall into, though they are sunken. Think more like large circular vats, maybe 2 or 3 meters across, dug down into the ground and lined with a sturdy waterproof plaster. And the colors. Oh, the colors. While Kano became most famous for its indigo blue, there are other pits here too, or you might see areas where other colors were produced. But right now, as you approach this cluster, the dominant color is that incredible, deep, intense blue. The edges of the pits are often crusted with layers of dried dye, creating a sort of geological record of countless dipping cycles. The ground around them is stained a patchwork of blues, blacks, and earthy browns, where spills and splashes have dried over centuries. The air around the pits is thick with the smell. It's the smell of fermentation, of organic matter breaking down, of the specific, slightly sulfurous aroma of indigo dye vats at work. It's a smell that gets into your clothes, your hair, your very skin if you linger long enough. It's the smell of generations of work of a craft passed down father to son, of an entire industry built on digging holes in the ground and dipping cloth into liquid magic. You stand at the edge of one of the pits, peering down. The liquid inside is often a dark, murky blue-black maybe, with a greenish or purplish sheen on the surface, especially when the sun hits it. Sometimes you can see tiny bubbles rising, proof that the complex chemistry within is alive and working. The edges of the pit are worn smooth in places, polished by countless hands leaning on them, supporting themselves as they stirred or pulled out cloth. This isn't a museum exhibit you're looking at. This is a working living, or at least historically living. In the period we're imagining industrial zone, albeit one that looks like it hasn't changed its fundamental design in hundreds of years. The tools you might glimpse nearby are simple long wooden poles for stirring, perhaps some baskets for carrying materials, drying racks made of simple wooden frames. The technology is ancient, but the results were world-class. You can imagine the sounds here too beyond the city's general hum. The sloshing of the dye as it stirred, the rhythmic thud of heavy poles against the sides of the pit. Maybe the splash as a piece of cloth is plunged in or pulled out. The low murmur of voices, the dyers talking amongst themselves, perhaps haggling with a customer over a price, or just sharing stories under the hot sun. The fact that these pits, or at least remnants of them, still exist today is kind of remarkable. Kano's history as a dyeing center goes back a really long time, like estimated over 500 years, maybe even more. That's a mainstream historical fact, right? The Kano dye pits are among the oldest continuously operating industrial sites in Africa. Think about that. For half a millennium or longer, people have been coming to this exact spot, digging these pits, mixing these concoctions, and turning plain cloth into vibrant art. It predates most of the European Industrial Revolution by centuries. While factories were just starting to churn out goods in Europe, in the 18th and 19th centuries, Kano dyers had already perfected their craft over generations, using techniques that relied on deep understanding of natural chemistry and fermentation. It's said that the secret recipes for the best blues were guarded ferociously, passed down only within specific families or guilds. This guarded knowledge is part of what gave Kano's cloth its value and reputation. You can almost feel the weight of that history hanging in the air here, mixed in with the smell of the dye. And speaking of secrets and recipes, there's a quirky, maybe slightly unsettling tidbit about some historical dye processes, not just in Kano, but certain traditional methods across different cultures. Sometimes to get the chemistry just right to kickstart fermentation, or adjust pH, human urine was used. Yeah, you heard that right. The ammonia in urine was a valuable component in some dye baths, helping to make the colors fix better to the fabric. So while standing here breathing in the aroma, you might just be getting a faint whiff of biological history too. Adds a certain flavor to the historical immersion, doesn't it? Probably best not to dwell on that bit too much, especially before trying to sleep. Let's just say the dyers were resourceful chemists using readily available ingredients. Historians still argue whether the specific methods used in Kano were developed entirely independently, or if they were influenced by dyeing techniques brought across the Sahara trade routes, perhaps from North Africa, or even further afield. It's one of those open scholarly debates. Did the knowledge bloom here in isolation, or was it a fusion of local innovation and external ideas? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, as trade routes rarely just moved goods. They moved ideas, techniques, and people too. But Kano's dyers definitely put their own unique stamp on the process, perfecting it over centuries to suit their materials and climate. As you walk past the pits, you might see bolts of cloth laid out on the ground or draped over low walls to dry brilliant blue against the dusty earth. The color is intense, unlike anything you usually see from modern synthetic dyes. It has a depth, a richness that seems to absorb the light. Some pieces might be plain cloth waiting to be dipped multiple times to achieve the darkest possible shade, almost black. Others might be tied or stitched before dyeing to create resist patterns, resulting in intricate white designs against the blue background. This technique, similar to tie dyeing or batik, was and still is where the craft survives, a specialty turning simple cloth into complex wearable art. You might also notice the people. Not just tourists like our mental selves, but figures moving amongst the pits, perhaps, stirring the liquid with those long poles, their arms strong and movements practiced. Their clothes are often stained with the inescapable blue. Their hands and feet, too, might carry the permanent mark of their trade. These are the dyers, the inheritors of this ancient tradition, men whose lives are tied quite literally to these colorful holes in the ground. They are the heart of this place, the keepers of the recipes, and the techniques, the ones who physically perform the demanding work. The air here feels heavy, not just with the heat and the smells, but with the weight of time. Every pit tells a story. Every stain on the ground is a record of countless dips, countless pieces of cloth transformed, countless transactions made. It's a place where the past isn't just something you read about in books, it's something you can see, smell, and almost touch. You can feel the energy of this ancient industrial site, the slow, steady rhythm of a craft that has endured for centuries, shaping the economy, the culture, and even the landscape of this part of the world. You stand for a moment longer just observing, letting the unique atmosphere settle over you. The low hum of activity, the specific earthy chemical aroma, the dazzling patches of blue under the African sun. It's a sensory overload, but a strangely calming one, like witnessing something so old and enduring that it makes the worries of the modern world seem fleeting and small. This is where the journey truly begins, at the edge of these ancient bubbling vats of color, feeling the air, understanding that you are stepping into a place defined by earth, water, plant, matter, and human ingenuity stirred together for half a millennium. You're standing there by the edge of one of those incredible pits, the smell of history and fermentation heavy in the air. It's a smell that is in a way the smell of the key ingredient. Because before this was a pit full of murky, magical liquid, it was just a plant, a humble plant. The source of all this intense blue isn't a mineral dug from the ground or a chemical mixed in a lab, at least not for most of history. It comes from plants, specifically plants containing compounds that can be coaxed through a bit of organic chemistry and a lot of elbow grease into creating that vibrant pigment. In this part of the world, the star of the show is typically the indigo plant, the Indigofera, species often Indigofera tinctoria, or closely related varieties. Imagine a small shrubby plant, maybe knee-high with delicate green leaves. Nothing particularly flashy about it visually is there. You wouldn't pick it out of a lineup of random bushes and think, ah yes, the source of centuries of wealth and world-renowned textiles. But that unassuming greenery holds the potential for incredible color. The blue pigment indigo doesn't actually exist in the leaves of the living plant in its blue form. It's there as a colorless precursor, a molecule called indican. Think of indican as latent blue waiting for its moment to shine. To unlock that potential, you need to harvest the plant. The best time is usually when the leaves are mature and full of that indican goodness. So you'd be out under the hot sun, cutting the leafy tops of the indigo bushes. It's repetitive work probably done in the cooler parts of the morning or late afternoon, but still hot, dusty, and requiring nimble hands. You'd gather bundles of these leafy stalks, the green contrasting vividly with the dry brown earth around you. Once harvested, the leaves need to be processed. They might be dried first, perhaps laid out on mats in the sun, turning brittle and slightly faded. Then they need to be broken down. Historically, this would involve pounding them maybe with large mortars and pestles, or grinding them in simple mills. The goal is to break open the plant cells and release that precious indican compound. You'd end up with a coarse powder or fibrous mash of dried indigo leaves. This is the raw material that gets transported perhaps in sacks or baskets to the dye pits. Now let's look back at the pits. You've got this sunken vat lined and waterproof. The main ingredient, the indigo mash, is added. But it's not just indigo. To make the magic happen, you need other things in there too. Things that help create the right chemical environment for the indican to transform. This is where the traditional recipes get interesting and varied. You'll find mention of ingredients like wood ash, which provides alkali lime date palm, pulp millet stalks, even animal waste. Yes, returning to that slightly unsettling thought from before, sometimes even stale urine was added. The ammonia helps with the alkalinity in fermentation. It sounds like a witch's brew, doesn't it? A pungent, bubbling concoction of plant matter ashes and various organic additives, all left to sit under the sun. And this is where the fermentation comes in. It's the critical middle step. You add water to the pit mix in the indigo mash and the other ingredients, and then you wait. Microorganisms naturally present in the mixture or introduced through the additives start to get to work. They feed on the plant matter and other organic compounds, creating a low-oxygen alkaline environment. In this environment, the indican molecule, that colorless precursor, undergoes a chemical reaction. It breaks down or hydrolyzes, releasing a different molecule called indoxyl. Now, indoxyl is soluble in the alkaline water of the pit. It dissolves into the liquid, but it's still not blue. It's a yellowish or greenish liquid at this stage. This is why the dye bath in the pit often doesn't look bright blue when you peer into it. It looks murky, maybe dark green yellowish, or almost black, depending on the concentration and state of fermentation. The blue color only appears when the indoxyl comes into contact with oxygen, usually from the air. When that happens, two indoxyl molecules combine and oxidize, linking up to form the much larger stable indigo molecule. And that molecule is intensely blue, but crucially, it is not soluble in water. So the dyers have this pit full of liquid containing soluble, colorless indoxyl. They dip the cloth into this liquid. The cloth soaks up the liquid, carrying the indoxyl with it. Then they pull the cloth out of the pit and expose it to the air. As the oxygen hits the fabric that is saturated with indoxyl-rich liquid, the indoxyl molecules on the surface rapidly oxidize, linking together to form the insoluble blue indigo pigment, which then gets trapped within the fibers of the cloth. It's a brilliant bit of applied chemistry worked out through generations of trial and error. Long before anyone knew what molecules were, they just knew that if you mix these things together, let them sit, and then dipped cloth in the resulting liquid and pulled it out, it turned blue. Simple, right? Except getting the fermentation just right is tricky. The bath has to be alkaline enough, but not too alkaline. It needs to be fermented enough to convert the indican to indoxyl, but not so much that other unwanted reactions happen. The temperature plays a role. It's a delicate balance a living chemistry set, and it requires skill and experience to maintain. A poorly fermented bath won't dye properly or the color will be weak. This dependency on natural fermentation is one reason these pits often look and smell the way they do. That slightly sulfurous organic aroma. That's the smell of bacteria doing their thing, breaking down plant material and producing various compounds as byproducts. It's the smell of the living dye bath working its subtle ancient magic. You might feel a warmth rising from the pits too, a gentle heat generated by the fermentation process itself, like a giant, slow-cooking stew of plant matter and potential color. And how do you keep this living, delicate bath healthy and ensure the soluble indoxyl is evenly distributed? You stir it a lot. This is where the physical labor really comes in. Imagine the dyer, often a strong man, standing at the edge of the pit. He'll have a long pole, sometimes bamboo or a sturdy piece of wood, maybe 10 or 12 feet long. The end of the pole is likely flattened or has a cross piece to help agitate the liquid effectively. He'll plunge the pole into the pit, pushing it down, sweeping it around, and pulling it back up. Over and over. It's not just a casual poke. It's a vigorous stirring designed to mix the sediment from the bottom into the liquid, to ensure the temperature is relatively even, and to keep that precious indoxyl in suspension or evenly dissolve. You can hear it, the deep sloshing sound of the pole moving through the thick liquid, maybe scraping against the sides of the pit, a steady rhythmic sound that has been a part of the soundscape of Kano for centuries. Thud slosh, a human-powered machine keeping the chemistry alive. This isn't just about mixing, it's about maintenance. Stirring helps prevent the bath from going dead or developing uneven concentrations. It's a constant tending a dialogue with the living dye. The dyer watches the liquid, perhaps judging its readiness by the color, the smell, the bubbles rising to the surface, or the flower. A specific film or sheen that might appear on the surface when the bath is ready. The physical toll of this work must have been immense, especially under the hot sun. Bending, pushing, pulling, stirring a heavy, dense liquid for extended periods. Hands might be calloused, closed, permanently stained blue muscles, built strong by the repetitive motion. It's a quiet strength, not the dramatic strength of a warrior or a builder, but the enduring power of someone engaged in steady, necessary labor. You can almost feel the strain in your own arms as you imagine handling that heavy, dripping pole. Maybe your shoulders ache just thinking about it. Upper Body Workout Ancient Dyer Edition. Probably sold out immediately if it were a modern gym class. Historians still argue whether there was a precise, universally followed secret recipe in Kano, or if techniques varied significantly from one family or workshop to another. It's one of those open scholarly debates. Were the formulas highly standardized, or was it more of a guild-based knowledge with individual variations and secret ingredients unique to each master dyer? Given the nature of traditional crafts passed down orally and through apprenticeship, it's likely there was a core method with countless small, jealously guarded variations. that gave certain workshops an edge or a reputation for particular shades or durability. A quirky tidbit related to this process, some accounts mention that when the bath was considered particularly strong and healthy, it was said to be hot or alive. Dyers might even dip their arm into the bath to feel the warmth of the fermentation and judge its readiness. A true feel for the chemistry. And maybe also a good way to get perpetually blue hands. It's a hands-on approach to quality control, quite literally. The value of the indigo produced this way was enormous historically. Before the advent of synthetic dyes in the late 19th century, natural indigo was one of the few sources of a stable, vibrant blue. It was traded across continents, highly prized, and its production was a source of significant wealth for places like Kano. The quality of Kano blue was renowned across the Sahara and beyond. A mainstream historical fact is that Kano indigo cloth was a major export commodity, contributing significantly to the city's prosperity and its status as a key trading center in West Africa for centuries. Think of it. Piles of this blue cloth traveling across the desert on camelback, reaching markets in North Africa, the Middle East, maybe even Europe. It was like their version of high-tech electronics today, a valuable manufactured good that everyone wanted. As you watch or imagine watching the stirring, you appreciate the sheer physicality and the deep knowledge required. It's not just following steps, it's understanding the state of mashdown of the bath, interpreting the subtle signs of fermentation, knowing when it's ready, when it needs adjusting, when it's nearing exhaustion. This wasn't a job for someone who didn't pay attention. You had to be connected to the process, almost feel the life in the pit. The slow, deliberate movements of the stir, the deep blue-black liquid swirling the thick air, the scent of the ongoing chemical reaction. It all paints a picture of an ancient, effective technology deeply integrated with the natural world and the rhythms of life in Kano. It's a process born from observation, experimentation, and the transmission of knowledge through generations, a testament to human ingenuity using the resources at hand. It's dirty, it's smelly, it's hard work. But the result is that incredible, enduring blue that defined Kano's reputation for so long. You've watched the preparation, the careful tending of the plants, the transformation into that earthy mash. You've seen the pit itself, a sunken cauldron of potential, and felt the rhythm of the stirring, the unseen forces of fermentation at work below the surface. Now comes the moment you've been waiting for, the step where the invisible becomes visible, where potential is unlocked and bursts forth as color. It's time to dye the cloth. Imagine the fabric laid out nearby, perhaps lengths of hand-woven cotton, maybe crisp white, or a pale, undyed beige. It could be a long strip destined for a wrapper or a garment, or smaller pieces that will become intricate patterns. The dyers would typically prepare the cloth beforehand, washing it thoroughly to remove any sizing or impurities, ensuring it's ready to absorb the liquid evenly. Some processes might involve tie-dyeing or other resist techniques where parts of the fabric are bound or covered to prevent the dye from reaching them, creating patterns. But for now, let's picture a simple piece of plain cloth waiting to embrace its new identity. The dyer, perhaps the same one who was just stirring, or maybe a different specialist in the dipping process, approaches the pit. He carefully takes a length of the prepared cloth. Remember that murky liquid in the pit. It doesn't look like much, does it? Dark greenish yellow maybe, with a strange, almost metallic sheen or film on the surface. The flower we mentioned a sign the bath is healthy and ready. The dyer knows instinctively whether the bath is ripe for dyeing. He might perform a small test dip with a scrap of cloth, watching how quickly the color develops before committing a large, valuable piece. With practiced hands, the dyer begins to feed the cloth into the pit. It's not just thrown in, it's immersed slowly, deliberately, ensuring every fiber is saturated with the liquid. He might use a pole or his hands protected perhaps by years of calluses or specific rituals, though the traditional setup often meant direct contact, leading to those famously blue hands and arms. The cloth disappears into the dark depths of the pit, soaking up that precious liquid containing the soluble indoxal. It stays submerged for a period, the duration depending on the desired depth of color, the strength of the bath, and the type of fabric. This isn't a quick dunk. It's a controlled immersion, giving the liquid time to penetrate deep into the fibers. As the cloth sits in the anaerobic, low-oxygen environment of the pit, the indoxal-rich liquid is absorbed. Nothing much changes visually while it's submerged, except perhaps the cloth darkening slightly as it becomes wet. It's like waiting for a secret to be revealed. You know the potential is there hidden beneath the surface. Then the moment of truth. The dyer begins to carefully pull the cloth back out of the pit. As the fabric emerges from the liquid and hits the air, something incredible happens. It's not blue yet. As it first surfaces, it often appears a sickly, yellowish green, the color of the indoxyl solution itself. But almost instantly, as oxygen from the atmosphere touches the fabric, a transformation begins. It's a magical, almost instantaneous reaction. The yellow-green starts to shift. It deepens, turning greenish-blue, then rapidly becomes a vibrant, rich blue right before your eyes. This process is called oxidation, and it's the key to the whole operation. The indoxyl molecules now clinging to the fabric fibers react with the airborne oxygen. They link up 2 by 2, forming the larger stable indigo molecule, which is insoluble in water. And this is the blue pigment. It literally precipitates out of the solution inside the fabric fibers, getting trapped there. It's like the fabric is a net catching these newly formed blue particles. Imagine pulling a long strip of fabric from the pit. As it emerges, you see this wave of color washing over it, changing from dull yellow-green to brilliant blue in seconds. It's astonishing to witness, even if you understand the chemistry. It feels like alchemy. Look, I just pulled this soggy swamp rag out and bam, it's blue. Who needs magic wands when you have oxygen? You can almost hear the oohs and ahs from any onlookers. This visual drama is a key part of the process and must have felt powerful and mysterious to those less familiar with the craft. As the cloth is pulled out, it's often hung up to air. The dyers might drape it over racks, poles, or even spread it on the ground in a clean area, allowing the air to circulate freely and complete the oxidation. This airing step is crucial. The more oxygen that reaches the fabric, the more indoxyl is converted to indigo, and the deeper and more stable the blue will become. You might see multiple lengths of cloth hanging or spread out around the pits, slowly deepening in color as they dry and oxidize. They start yellow-green and slowly visibly turn blue over minutes. This oxidation process is also why the dyer might agitate the cloth slightly as it hangs, gently shaking it or turning it to ensure maximum air exposure. It's not just about drying, it's about facilitating that chemical reaction. The smell in the air around the drying racks changes too. That strong fermenting smell from the pit is replaced by a different aroma, perhaps a faint, clean scent mixed with the unique smell of the fresh indigo pigment settling onto the fibers. The depth of the blue depends on several factors, but crucially on the number of times the cloth is dipped and aired. A single dip will give a pale sky blue shade. To achieve the deep, almost black blue that Kano was famous for, the cloth had to be dipped repeatedly, sometimes dozens, even up to 100 times, with full oxidation and airing between each dip. Think about that for a moment. Pulling a piece of fabric out, letting it oxidize, plunging it back in, pulling it out, letting it oxidize. Repeating this cycle scores of times for a single piece of high-quality cloth. That's dedication. It's not just a job, it's a ritual of patience and persistence. Each subsequent dip adds more layers of the blue pigment onto the fabric. The first dip lays down a foundation. The second dip adds more indigo, making the blue stronger. Each subsequent dip builds density, making the color richer, deeper, and more intense. It's like building a wall brick by brick, except the bricks are microscopic indigo particles clinging to cotton fibers. This layering is what gives traditional indigo-dyed cloth its incredible depth and durability. The color isn't just painted on the surface, it's built up within the fabric structure. The specific shade of blue achieved also depends on the strength and health of the dye bath, the concentration of indoxyl, the additives used in fermentation, the temperature and the duration of each dip. Experienced dyers could manipulate these factors to achieve slightly different shades, from a pale, powdery blue to the deep, dark Kano blue that was so highly prized. There wasn't just one blue. There was a spectrum, each shade requiring a slightly different approach or number of dips. Consider the labor involved in this multi-dip process. If a single piece of cloth needed 50 dips, and each dip involved pulling it out, airing it for some time, and plunging it back in, that's an enormous amount of manual work per piece. Imagine the sheer volume of cloth passing through the pits over centuries and the cumulative effort represented by each bowl to finish fabric. It makes you look at a piece of traditional indigo cloth with a newfound respect. This wasn't mass production in the modern sense. It was craftsmanship built on relentless repetition and skill. A quirky tidbit related to the dipping. It's said that experienced dyers could tell the readiness and strength of the bath, not just by the flour on the surface or the smell, but also by the feel of the liquid when they dipped their hands or the cloth into it. A hot or a live bath had a certain viscosity or warmth from the fermentation. It's like a baker knowing when the dough is ready by touch. This intuitive knowledge passed down through generations was as crucial as any recipe. It adds another layer to the idea of the dyer having a relationship with their living dye bath. They weren't just following instructions, they were sensing the state of a complex biological and chemical system. Yep, feels judgy today, bath must be strong. Mainstream historical fact. The intensive labor required to achieve deep blue shades meant that darker indigo cloth was significantly more expensive and often a status symbol. In many West African societies, wearing deeply dyed blue cloth indicated wealth, prestige, or importance. The famous Tuareg people, often called the Blue Men of the Sahara, traditionally wore indigo-dyed garments that would bleed onto their skin, giving them a bluish tint, a symbol of their connection to this valuable commodity and their distinct identity. The color wasn't just decorative, it was loaded with social meaning. Historians still argue whether the precise techniques for achieving the very deepest, most stable shades of Kano blue were truly unique to the city, or if similar processes existed elsewhere, but didn't gain the same level of fame or market dominance. It's an open scholarly debate, was it? The specific local ingredients, the climate, the skill of the dyers, or a combination that gave Kano its edge? While indigo dyeing was practiced across various parts of the world, the scale, quality, and commercial success of Kano's industry suggests there was something particularly effective about their methods, likely honed over centuries. Was there a secret additive, a specific fermentation starter, or just unparalleled mastery of the process? You might notice that the air around the drying cloth has a different quality than the air around the pits. Less pungent fermentation, more color developing. It's a subtle olfactory cue to the ongoing transformation. The sun beating down plays its part too, warming the cloth and perhaps subtly influencing the oxidation rate, though the primary need is air contact. As the dyed cloth hangs dripping its excess liquid back into the pit or into channels designed to return it, minimizing waste of the valuable bath, you can appreciate the slow, careful process. Each piece represents not just the raw material in the dye, but hours of labor monitoring, dipping, and airing. It's a testament to human perseverance and the pursuit of quality. Imagine doing this day in, day out, your hands stained blue, the rhythmic movement of dipping and pulling a constant part of your life. It's repetitive, yes, but the moment that color blooms on the fabric must provide a deep satisfaction, a visible reward for the effort. The drying racks, often simple wooden frames or poles, become temporary canvases displaying the progress of the dyeing. You see cloth in various stages, some pale green, others a developing turquoise, many reaching that final deep, rich blue. The air itself seems to hum with the quiet energy of chemistry in action, a large-scale natural process orchestrated by human hands and traditional knowledge. It's a reminder that even the most vibrant colors we use often have humble, organic, and sometimes messy origins. No fancy machines here, just pits, plants, fermentation air, and a whole lot of manual labor. It makes you wonder if we appreciate color enough today when it comes so easily from a factory. These dyers earned their blue, and the blue once set through oxidation is remarkably fast. Indigo is known for its light fastness. It resists fading when exposed to sunlight, which is part of why it was so valuable for clothing and textiles exposed to the elements. The insoluble pigment is locked deep within the fibers. It might rub off slightly, hence the blue men, especially with friction and sweat leading to the characteristic crocking of traditional indigo. But the core color remains wash after wash, exposure after exposure. It's a stable, durable blue, a testament to the effectiveness of this ancient oxidation process. Thinking about the repetitive dipping and airing, it's easy to imagine the dyers developing a sort of meditative rhythm. Push in, pull out, let it bloom, repeat. The physical labor combined with the focus required to monitor the process could become almost hypnotic. It's a physically demanding job that also requires a keen eye and a deep understanding of the materials in the living bath. They were in a sense choreographing a chemical reaction using their bodies and experience to guide nature's processes towards a desired artistic and commercial outcome. It puts a whole new spin on performance art, doesn't it? You've seen the cloth emerge, that magical shift from yellow-green to brilliant blue as it meets the air, hanging like banners around the pits, dripping and deepening in color. That was the first step, the creation of the fundamental blue. But as beautiful as plain indigo can be, the true artistry and often the highest value lay in the patterns. Not every piece of cloth emerging from these pits was destined to be a simple, solid blue wrapper. Many were intended to carry complex geometric or symbolic designs, created through a technique that feels almost counterintuitive, hiding parts of the fabric from the dye you're working so hard to apply to the rest. This is resist dyeing, a technique found in various forms across the world, but with its own unique character and mastery in places like Kano and other West African textile centers. The principle is simple: apply something to the fabric that the dye cannot penetrate, dip the cloth in the dye bath, and when you remove the resist material, the areas it covered remain the original color, contrasting with the dyed parts. Think of it like reverse painting, or maybe like getting sunscreen applied in a pattern before you go out in the sun, ending up with a sunburned background and pale patterns where the cream was. Though let's hope you didn't actually try that with crocodile dung sunscreen. In this region, one of the most prominent resist techniques was tie-dyeing, known locally by names like Adir, particularly further south. But the fundamental methods were certainly part of the repertoire here. Imagine the artisans, often women in this phase of the process, sitting with the undyed or lightly dyed cloth before it goes into the pit for the final deep dips. They would take threads, sometimes raffia fiber, sometimes cotton, and begin to knot, tie, and stitch sections of the fabric. Picture the process. Small pebbles or seeds might be tied tightly into the cloth to create circular patterns. Lengths of string could be wound tightly around sections of fabric, creating stripes or bands. Or using a needle and thread, intricate patterns could be stitched onto the cloth, and then the threads pulled taut to gather the fabric into tight pleats or bunches. Each knot, each stitch, each tightly bound section is an intentional act of resistance. It's the artist saying, "You blue dye shall not pass here." It's meticulous work, tying off hundreds, maybe thousands of tiny points on a single piece of fabric to create a pattern of dots. Stitching a complex geometric design, gathering the fabric along the thread like a tiny, dense ruffle. The tighter the tie or stitch, the more effective the resist. If the resist isn't tight enough, the dye might seep under it, creating blurry or uneven lines. Sometimes a desired effect, sometimes a sign of less careful work. The beauty of this technique lies in its simplicity and its versatility. By varying the size of the tied objects, the thickness of the string, the pattern of the stitching, and the tightness of the knots, an astonishing array of designs could be created. Simple dots, rings, squares, stripes, and more complex geometric shapes could all emerge from the careful manipulation of fabric and thread before dyeing. This step requires patience, manual dexterity, and a clear vision of the final pattern hidden within the tied and bunched fabric. After the fabric is meticulously tied or stitched, it goes into the indigo pit following the same dipping and oxidation process we just explored. But now the dye bath can only reach the areas of the cloth that are not covered by the resist. The blue pigment develops on these exposed parts. The areas protected by the tight knots or stitching remain the original color of the fabric, usually white or a pale off-white if it was undyed, or perhaps a lighter shade of blue if the pattern was being applied over a pre-dyed, less intense base. Then comes the reveal, which is perhaps the most exciting part of the process for the artisan and anyone watching. After the final dips and oxidation, the fabric is allowed to dry. Once dry, or sometimes while still slightly damp, the resist materials are removed. The threads are untied, the knots are cut, the stitch threads are pulled out, and the pebbles or seeds fall away. As the fabric is smoothed out, the pattern that was hidden within its folds and ties is finally revealed. Imagine pulling a piece of fabric that looked like a crumpled mess of knots and strings out of the dye pit. It's a uniform dark blue crumpled shape. Now, as you patiently untie knot after knot, a crisp white circle appears against the deep blue background. You untie another and another, and soon a field of perfect white polka dots emerges. Or perhaps you pull out a long gathering stitch in a precise geometric line of white zigzags across the blue field. It's like unwrapping a gift or developing a photograph, a pattern appearing from nowhere thanks to the careful preparation beforehand. This act of revealing the pattern must have been incredibly satisfying. Hours of tying and stitching followed by the messy business of dyeing, all culminating in this moment of unveiling. It's a tangible reward for the intricate, sometimes tedious, preparatory work. You can almost hear a sigh of relief or a quiet exclamation of pleasure as a particularly complex pattern comes out perfectly crisp. Aha, nailed that complex zigzag pattern. Take that slippery indigo. Beyond simple tying and stitching, other resist methods were also used in West Africa. One notable technique involved using a paste made from cassava flour or other starchy materials. This paste would be applied to the fabric using stencils or freehand, creating patterns. Once dried, this paste forms a barrier that prevents the indigo dye from penetrating the fabric underneath. After dyeing and oxidation, the paste is washed off, revealing the pattern. This method allows for different kinds of lines and shapes than tie-dye, often bolder graphics or larger areas of resist. The choice of resist technique often dictated the style and appearance of the finished cloth. Tie-dye tends to create patterns with a certain organic quality, with lines that might bleed slightly or dots that aren't perfectly uniform, bearing the mark of the hand that tied them. Paste resist can create sharper, more defined lines, especially when stencils are used. Both require significant skill and experience to execute effectively, particularly on a large scale. After the resist material is removed, the cloth often needs further processing. This typically involves washing it thoroughly to remove any residual dye that hasn't fully oxidized and isn't bonded to the fiber, as well as washing away the resist paste if used, or any remaining bits of thread or fiber from the tying. This washing is important for the durability and feel of the cloth, and also helps reduce crocking, the tendency of excess indigo pigment to rub off onto skin or other surfaces, which is a characteristic and sometimes desired trait of traditional indigo. Finally, a distinctive finishing step for high-quality indigo cloth in this region was beading or hammering. Imagine taking the washed and dried lengths of fabric and laying them out on a smooth, hard surface, perhaps a log, a stone, or a specially prepared beating block. Then, using a wooden mallet or club, the cloth is systematically and vigorously beaten. This might sound counterintuitive, beating fabric, but this process serves several purposes. Firstly, it further softened the fibers, which could become stiff after repeated dyeing and washing. Secondly, and crucially, it compressed the fibers and the indigo pigment embedded within them, giving the cloth a smooth, almost lustrous surface and a beautiful sheen. This hammering essentially burnishes the fabric and the dye, locking the color in even more firmly and giving the cloth a distinctive texture and drape. The sound of this beating must have been a characteristic part of the soundscape around the dyeing centers. A rhythmic thudding day after day as lengths of deep blue fabric were patiently hammered into submission and beauty. It's another layer of labor and skill added to the cloth beyond the growing, preparing, fermenting, dipping, and pattern making. Each piece of finished cloth represents a symphony of manual processes, each contributing to the final product's look, feel, and durability. A quirky tidbit about the beating process. In some traditions, specific types of wood were preferred for the beating mallets or blocks believed to impart a better finish or even have symbolic significance. The choice of wood, the weight of the mallet, and the rhythm and force of the beating were all elements of the craft passed down through apprenticeship. It wasn't just mindless hammering. It was a skilled process requiring consistency and knowledge to achieve the desired sheen without damaging the fabric. Imagine arguing with a fellow dyer. "Oh, you're using that wood mine? Gives a much classier sheen, darling." Mainstream historical fact. The intricate patterns created through resist dyeing combined with the deep, stable indigo color made West African textiles highly sought after, both locally and in trans-Saharan trade. These patterned cloths were not just clothing. They were currency, status symbols, and artistic expressions traded across vast distances and influencing textile designs in other cultures. The patterns themselves often carried symbolic meanings, communicating identity status or beliefs, turning the cloth into a form of visual language. Historians still argue whether certain complex resist dyeing techniques, particularly those involving intricate stitching or precise paste application, developed independently in multiple West African centers or spread from a single point of origin. Was there cross-pollination of ideas between, say, Kano and the Adir centers in what is now Nigeria, or did similar techniques arise spontaneously due to the shared resource of indigo and the human desire for patterned textiles? It's an open scholarly debate tracing the diffusion of technology and artistic practice across pre-colonial Africa. As you watch the finished cloths being folded or prepared for market, the deep blue contrasted with sharp white or lighter blue patterns, you appreciate the journey they've taken. From a leafy plant through fermentation in an earthy pit, stirred by hand, dipped and oxidized repeatedly, painstakingly tied and stitched, and finally washed and beaten into submission, or rather into perfection. Each piece is a story of process, patience, and collaboration between nature and human hands. The patterns themselves are a universe of design. Simple geometric shapes, interlocking lines that dance and weave dots that speckle the surface like scattered stars. Some patterns are named referring to everyday objects, animals, or proverbs, anchoring the abstract design in cultural context. You're not just looking at blue and white, you're looking at history, symbolism, and artistry woven into the very fabric. It's a far cry from patterns printed by machine. These carry the vibration of every hand touch, every knot tied every beat of the mallet. The value of these finished cloths was immense. They were durable, color-fast, and beautiful, representing significant labor input. Owning such cloth was a clear marker of success or position within society. Even the crocking, the slight bleeding of excess indigo onto the skin, became a mark of authenticity and wealth, signifying that the wearer could afford genuine, deeply dyed indigo, not some cheap imitation. To have blue-stained skin from your clothes, that was a humble brag centuries before social media. The process of pattern making adds another layer of human creativity and skill to the already complex dyeing operation. It shifts from purely a chemical and biological process, the fermentation and oxidation, to an artistic one where design and aesthetic intention come to the forefront. The men working the pits, the women tying the patterns, the workers washing and beating, each played a crucial role in transforming the raw materials into valuable, beautiful textiles that traveled far and wide. It's a textile ecosystem with different specialists contributing their unique expertise. You can almost feel the smooth, cool surface of the beaten cloth, the slight texture where the patterns were resisted the weight of the quality fabric. It carries the scent of earth fermentation faintly now, and the unique smell of indigo. It's a tactile history, a piece of the past you could theoretically wear. Though maybe give it a few extra washes first unless you want blue skin. It really was a status symbol. You've seen the finished product, the beautiful patterned cloth, a testament to layers of skill, from growing the plant, to stirring the vat, to tying the resists and beating the fabric smooth. But all of that artistry, all of that value ultimately depended on the lifeblood of the operation, the indigo pits themselves. These weren't just holes in the ground filled with liquid. They were complex living ecosystems demanding constant attention, knowledge, and care from the men who managed them. Think of a pit not like a machine, but like a sourdough starter, or maybe a particularly high-maintenance houseplant, if that houseplant happened to be a bubbling, slightly pungent vat of fermentation. You couldn't just set it up and walk away. It needed to be nurtured, fed, monitored, and understood. Each pit had its own character, its own moods, and its own rhythm. The successful dyer was not just a chemist or a laborer, but a kind of pit whisperer, attuned to the subtle signs of its health and vitality. Maintaining the correct conditions within the pit was paramount. Remember how the indigo molecule needs to be reduced and become soluble. That magical transformation happens best in an alkaline environment and at a specific temperature range fueled by fermentation. So the pit managers were constantly working to keep this delicate balance just right. This involved adding the right ingredients in the right proportions at the right time. The main ingredients beyond the indigo leaves or extract were alkaline substances. Traditionally, this often meant ash from burnt plant materials like millet stalks or wood. These ashes contain carbonates and hydroxides that raise the pH of the water, making it alkaline. Sometimes lime calcium hydroxide was also used, derived from burnt shells or limestone if available. These alkalis were the key to unlocking the indigo's potential, making the reduced form the leuco-indigo, remember, soluble in water. Adding the alkali wasn't a one-time thing. As dyeing progressed, or as the pit aged, the alkalinity could drop. Dipping cloth into the pit also removed some of the soluble indigo and other compounds. So the pit managers had to regularly test the pit's strength and add more alkali as needed. How did they test this? It wasn't with fancy pH meters, obviously. It was through experience observation, and sometimes astonishingly, by dipping a finger or even tasting the liquid. A slightly acrid or bitter taste might indicate sufficient alkalinity, but too much could damage the fibers. It was a skill honed over years understanding the pit's subtle language. Temperature was another critical factor. The fermentation process that reduces the indigo is driven by microbes, and microbes are fussy about temperature. If the pit got too cold, the fermentation would slow down or stop entirely, and the indigo wouldn't reduce properly. If it got too hot, different undesirable microbes might take over, leading to spoilage or poor dye results. Controlling the temperature wasn't easy in an open-air environment. Pit complexes were often situated in areas with some shade, perhaps under trees, or simple thatched roofs, to prevent direct sunlight from overheating the pits. In cooler weather or during the night, the pits might lose heat. There wasn't really a way to heat a pit beyond maybe placing warm stones nearby, though that seems impractical for large vats. Mostly it was about managing the location and the environment. You could sometimes tell the health of a pit by its activity. A happy pit might have a slight fizzing or bubbling on the surface, a sign of active fermentation. The stirring we talked about earlier wasn't just about mixing, it was also part of the maintenance. Gentle stirring helped distribute the ingredients, brought fresh liquid into contact with the submerged leaves or sediment, and helped assess the pit's readiness. However, too much vigorous stirring could introduce too much oxygen, which would oxidize the leuco-indigo back to the insoluble blue form inside the pit, making the dye bath weaker. It was a delicate balance. Stir gently to keep things moving, but don't aerate it like you're whipping meringue. Over time, sediment would build up at the bottom of the pit, spent indigo leaves, ash, residue, and other organic matter. This sludge needed to be managed. Some pits were periodically emptied and cleaned, though this was a major undertaking and meant the pit was out of commission for a while. In other cases, they might try to keep the sludge at the bottom and draw liquid from above. Managing this waste and sediment was part of the ongoing chore, a less glamorous side of the vibrant dyeing process. A quirky tidbit about pit management. Some dyer families or communities were said to have secret ingredients or specific rituals associated with their pits to ensure their vitality. This might be adding small amounts of urine or specific plant parts believed to boost fermentation, or even conducting small ceremonies. These practices, blending practical knowledge with traditional beliefs, highlight the deep connection the dyers felt with their vats, viewing them as entities with their own needs and even personalities. It wasn't just chemistry, it was also a bit of magic, or at least deeply ingrained tradition. Like adding a secret ingredient to your family chili recipe. You swear it works even if you can't scientifically prove why. Monitoring the pit's strength and readiness required skill. Before dipping valuable cloth, a small test strip might be used. The way the strip took the color, how quickly the blue bloomed on contact with air, the depth of the shade achieved after a few dips. These were all read as signs of the pit's potency. An experienced dyer could look at the color of the liquid itself, which would be a murky greenish yellow in a healthy reduced state note, any surface characteristics, and smell the subtle aroma of fermentation, and know if the pit was ready for work or needed adjustment. A pit could and sometimes did die. This might happen if the balance was lost too severely. Perhaps overwhelming contamination, a drastic temperature swing, or a chemical imbalance that halted the fermentation. A dead pit couldn't reduce indigo, and its liquid would remain a useless muddy color. Reviving a dead pit was difficult, sometimes impossible, and represented a significant loss of time, resources, and labor. It was the constant fear looming over the dyer, the potential failure of their most critical tool. Imagine your main source of income suddenly deciding it doesn't feel like working today forever. Stressful. Historians still argue whether the composition of the alkaline additives used in different regions significantly impacted the final shade or quality of the indigo produced. Did using millet ash create a subtly different blue than using wood ash or lime? Were there specific properties in the ash from certain plants that made a pit particularly potent or long-lasting? It's an open scholarly debate attempting to link traditional agricultural practices and local resources to the specific characteristics of finished textiles from different areas. The sheer labor involved in this constant management shouldn't be underestimated. Carrying heavy loads of ash or lime, mixing them into the pit, carefully stirring, monitoring multiple pits, dealing with spills or overflows and periodically cleaning them out. It was physically demanding work often performed under the hot sun. These men weren't just stirring, they were carefully managing a complex biochemical process using generations of empirical knowledge. The success of a dyeing operation wasn't just about having indigo. It was about having healthy, productive pits. A dyer's reputation and his livelihood depended on his ability to keep his pits alive and strong, capable of producing consistently deep, vibrant blue. This required not just strength, but intellect, patience, and a deep connection to the materials and processes involved. They were early biotechnologists managing microbial communities for industrial-scale color production. The pit managers also had to be mindful of the water source. Clean water was essential. Contaminated water could introduce undesirable microbes or chemicals that could disrupt the delicate balance in the pit. The location of the pits, often near wells or rivers, was carefully chosen, but protecting that water source was also important. Think about the daily rhythm of the dyeing center. While some were tying patterns or washing cloth, others were focused solely on the pits. Adding ingredients in the morning, checking the temperature at midday, a gentle stir in the afternoon, perhaps adding more alkali in the evening based on the day's dipping activity. It was a never-ending cycle of monitoring and adjustment, a dialogue between the dyer and his dynamic vats. It wasn't a 9-to-5 job. It was a 24/7 responsibility dictated by the needs of the living pits. They probably didn't have weekends off. Sorry, darling, can't come to the festival, the pit's looking a bit peaky. The knowledge required for this wasn't written down in textbooks. It was passed down through apprenticeship from father to son, master to apprentice. Learning to read the signs of a pit's health, the color, the smell, the feel of the tiny bubbles, took years of hands-on experience. It was tacit knowledge, embodied skill learned by doing and observing. A young apprentice would start with simple tasks like carrying water or ash, gradually being taught how to stir, how to recognize the subtle shifts in the pit's condition, and eventually how to make the critical decisions about what to add and when. This deep practical understanding of the pits is a key part of the story. It wasn't just following a recipe, it was interpreting the pit's current state and responding appropriately. Was it too weak? Add more alkali. Was it too sluggish? Maybe it needs a warmer environment if possible, or some fresh organic matter to kickstart fermentation. Was the blue not blooming correctly? Check the pH check for contamination. It was constant problem solving, relying on accumulated wisdom. The economic success of a dyeing center was directly tied to the health and number of its pits. More healthy pits meant more cloth could be dyed, more blue produced, and more wealth generated. Keeping those pits running smoothly was the absolute foundation of the entire enterprise. Without the diligent, knowledgeable work of the pit managers, the beautiful patterned cloths, the trans-Saharan trade, the status symbols, none of it would have been possible. They were the unsung heroes, or at least the often underestimated heroes, tending the microbial engines of the indigo economy. Their relationship with the pits was symbiotic. The pits provided their livelihood, and in return, they provided the constant care and attention needed to keep the complex fermentation and reduction process functioning day after day, season after season. It's a powerful reminder of how much pre-industrial technologies relied on deep intuitive understanding of natural processes far removed from automated factories and digital readouts. It was hands-on, sensory, and profoundly skilled. You can almost picture them now leaning over the edge of a pit, sniffing the air, perhaps carefully scooping a little liquid onto their fingers to examine its color and feel their faces etched with experience and concentration, ensuring the precious blue would continue to flow. It was a constant negotiation with nature, coaxing a vibrant color from a humble plant through careful tending of a bubbling, earthy brew. A truly fascinating blend of agriculture, chemistry, microbiology, and pure old-fashioned hard work. You've gotten a feel for the rhythmic pulse of the pits, the constant tending, the quiet conversations the dyer has with his bubbling vats. You've seen the skill involved in keeping these living systems happy and productive, coaxing the deep blues from the fermentation and reduction dance. But like any system relying on delicate biological and chemical balances, these pits were perpetually vulnerable. The vibrant heart of the dyeing operation could be fragile, threatened by forces both natural and accidental. Dealing with disasters wasn't an occasional inconvenience. It was an ever-present risk, a potential catastrophe that could wipe out months of work, valuable materials, and the very foundation of the dyer's livelihood. Imagine tending your pits through weeks of careful work, the liquid, a healthy greenish yellow, the surface showing just the right hint of activity, and then disaster strikes. Perhaps it's the earth itself turning against you. These pits were often dug into the ground, sometimes lined with clay or other materials to prevent leakage. But the ground isn't always stable. Especially during periods of heavy rain, the soil around the pits could become saturated and weak. An older pit, or one not perfectly constructed, could simply collapse. The sides give way, the precious liquid spills out, mixing with mud and debris. The carefully nurtured microbial ecosystem destroyed in moments. Watching a pit collapse must have been devastating. It wasn't just losing the liquid. It was losing the months of preparation, the accumulated leuco-indigo, ready to dye the living bacterial culture that made it all possible. It was like your bakery suddenly deciding it doesn't want to be a bakery anymore, and just turning into a hole in the ground full of soggy flour and yeast. Game over. Cleaning up was a nightmare. Salvaging what little could be salvaged, digging out the mud, trying to rebuild the structure, and then starting the whole process over again from scratch. That's time, labor, and resources down the drain. But sometimes the disaster wasn't structural. It was biological or chemical. Contamination. Remember how the pit relies on a specific fermentation process. Introducing the wrong kind of bacteria, fungi, or chemicals could throw the whole system into chaos. Where could contamination come from? Surface runoff after rain carrying all sorts of things into the open pits? Animal waste, because hey, animals exist and they don't always respect industrial zones. Or maybe just accidental spills of incompatible substances used in other parts of the process or nearby activities. Imagine the dyer's horror dipping a test strip into a pit that had been performing beautifully only to see the blue bloom wrong or not bloom at all, or worse, see the fabric become damaged or stained and off color. A contaminated pit might smell wrong, the liquid might take on an unusual color or texture, or the fermentation might stop entirely. It was a delicate balance, easily upset. A bit like getting the wrong bacteria into your fancy kombucha starter. Suddenly, instead of a healthy SCOBY, you've got, well, something less appealing and definitely not drinkable. Reviving a contaminated pit was incredibly difficult, often impossible. The competing microorganisms might have taken over, or the rogue chemical might have irreversibly damaged the necessary conditions. Often, the only solution was to empty the pit, entirely dispose of the ruined contents, and start fresh. Again, a massive loss and setback. This is why the location of the pits, often away from immediate dwellings or waste sources, and the care taken with the water supply were so critical. Protecting those precious vats from the outside world was paramount. Then there were the challenges presented by the climate. Nigeria, like many places, experiences distinct wet and dry seasons in temperature variations. While indigo cultivation often thrived in specific climatic zones, the dyeing process itself was still exposed to the elements. Drought was a major threat. The dyeing process requires significant amounts of water, for soaking leaves, for the pit itself, for washing the dyed cloth. Extended periods without rain leading to low river levels or dry wells could cripple a dyeing operation. Without water, the pits couldn't be maintained, new ones couldn't be started, and the essential rinsing steps were impossible. A drought could bring an entire dyeing community to a standstill. Conversely, excessive rain could also spell disaster. We already mentioned pit collapses triggered by saturated ground, but heavy floods could be even worse. A flooded river might overflow its banks, inundating the entire dyeing complex. This could dilute the pits, destroying the delicate chemical balance, introduce massive amounts of silt and debris, and carry away materials and equipment. Imagine weeks of work quite literally washing away. It's like your fancy car wash suddenly becoming a mud wrestling arena, except your cars are irreplaceable cultural treasures. and the mud is biologically active goo. Not ideal. Temperature extremes also played a role. While Nigeria's climate is generally warm, variations occur. Excessive heat could overheat the pits, potentially killing the beneficial bacteria and promoting the growth of undesirable ones. In some regions, cooler periods, especially at night, could slow down fermentation significantly. While not as immediately catastrophic as a collapse or flood-sustained, suboptimal temperatures would lead to weaker dye baths, longer processing times, and reduced output, impacting profitability. Historians still argue whether certain traditional pit designs or locations were specifically developed to mitigate risks like flooding or temperature swings. Were pits placed on slight inclines to help with drainage? Were some designs deeper to maintain a more stable temperature? It's an open scholarly debate trying to understand if the empirical knowledge embedded in these structures went beyond just creating a container and actively incorporated strategies for resilience against environmental challenges. A quirky tidbit regarding climate challenges. Some oral traditions mention dyers attempting makeshift coverings or temporary shelters over their pits during periods of heavy rain or intense sun, perhaps using mats or fabric scraps. These weren't elaborate structures, but simple practical efforts to shield the vulnerable pits from the worst of the weather, a testament to the value they placed on these vats and their willingness to improvise to protect them. Imagine MacGyver trying to build a roof over a giant hole in the ground, using only palm fronds and determination. The human element also introduced potential problems. Mistakes happened. An apprentice might accidentally add too much alkali or the wrong kind of ash. Someone might forget to check a pit's temperature or stir it when needed. While not disasters in the same vein as a flood or collapse, these errors could weaken a pit, reduce the quality of the dye, or require significant effort to correct. The reliance on skilled attentive labor meant that human error was always a factor to manage. A mainstream historical fact is that the concentration of indigo dyeing centers in specific locations across Nigeria, such as Kano, Ibadan, and Abeokuta, was often influenced by the availability of essential resources like clean water sources and suitable land for digging pits, but also crucially by relatively stable climatic conditions that favored both indigo cultivation and the dyeing process itself. These weren't random locations. They were chosen in part because the risks of environmental disaster were deemed manageable or less frequent there compared to other areas. Recovery from a major disaster was a long and arduous process. A collapsed pit needed to be re-excavated, potentially relined, and then the entire pit preparation process, filling with water, adding ingredients, allowing fermentation to begin, had to start anew. This could take weeks or even months before the pit was ready to dye again. During this time, the dyer couldn't produce cloth, meaning a complete halt in income. The economic shockwaves of a pit collapse or contamination could be severe, affecting not just the dyer, but also the network of weavers, traders, and suppliers who depended on his output. Think about the stress of living with this constant vulnerability. You could do everything right, prepare the pit perfectly, use the best ingredients, follow all the traditional practices, and still lose everything overnight due to a freak storm or unexpected contamination. It required a certain resilience, a willingness to rebuild and restart in the face of significant loss. It was a stark reminder that even sophisticated pre-industrial technology was deeply intertwined with and dependent on the unpredictable forces of nature. The dyers developed methods passed down through generations for assessing the health of their pits and trying to anticipate problems. Learning to read the subtle signs, a change in smell, a different kind of fizzing, a slight variation in the greenish hue of the liquid, was not just about optimizing performance, but also about detecting the first signs of trouble. Early detection might allow for intervention, adding more alkali to correct the pH, trying to remove surface contaminants, or adjusting the schedule to account for temperature fluctuations. But some disasters were simply unavoidable. A regional drought wasn't something an individual dyer could fix. A major flood overwhelmed any local defenses. In such cases, the community often had to pull together, sharing resources where possible, supporting those who had lost their pits entirely. The interdependence of the dyeing community likely played a significant role in surviving these larger-scale environmental shocks. The knowledge of how to handle problems was as important as the knowledge of how to run things smoothly. Apprenticeship didn't just teach how to stir and dip. It taught problem-solving, what to do when the pit is sluggish, when the color isn't right, or when disaster strikes. It was crisis management learned through experience, passed down verbally through practical demonstration and shared wisdom. Remember what grandfather did when the well ran low? We rationed the water for the pits first, even the periodic emptying and cleaning of pits while a planned part of maintenance carried risks. Stirring up old sediment could potentially disrupt the microbial balance. Refilling and restarting always had the chance of the new batch not taking correctly. So even routine maintenance had elements of risk management built into it. It wasn't just a chore, it was a careful reset button, hoping everything would boot up correctly. The physical landscape of historical dyeing centers often bore the marks of these challenges. Empty, ruined pits might stand as silent monuments to past failures. Areas might show signs of drainage channels dug to divert water during rains. The choice of location itself was a form of risk mitigation, attempting to find areas less prone to the most devastating natural events. The constant threat of disaster highlights the precariousness of many pre-industrial trades. While the skills and knowledge were deep and refined, they were often dependent on factors outside human control: the weather, the environment, the health of biological processes. There was no insurance policy against a pit collapse, no government bailout for a drought-stricken dying community. Survival depended on resilience, community support, and the ability to rebuild, often starting again from very little. So while you might imagine the peaceful rhythmic dipping of fabric into vibrant blue, remember the ever-present shadow hanging over the dyer, the possibility that tomorrow their most valuable asset, the very heart of their operation, could be gone, turned into a muddy hole or a contaminated mess by forces they couldn't fully control. It adds a layer of tension and respect for the sheer hardiness and determination of the people who made this trade thrive for centuries despite these risks. They weren't just skilled artisans. They were also seasoned survivors navigating a world where nature could be both their greatest ally and their most formidable opponent. So you've navigated the treacherous waters of pit maintenance, dodged the metaphorical and sometimes literal pitfalls of contamination and collapse, and against all odds, your precious indigo pits have done their job. The fermentation has worked its magic. The reduction is complete, and you've carefully dipped load after load of cotton yarn or woven cloth, coaxing that vibrant blue into the fibers through repeated immersion and oxidation. It's a triumph of chemistry, biology, and sheer elbow grease. But the journey isn't over yet. The cloth isn't finished when it comes out of the pit. It's just wet and blue. Very, very wet and blue. The first step after those final dips, once you're satisfied with the depth of the color and your arms are aching from lifting sodden textiles, is rinsing. While the initial oxidation fixes the indigo to the fibers, there's still residual alkali and unreacted dye particles clinging to the cloth. Rinsing, often done in clean water, assuming you had enough water left after managing the pits and avoiding droughts. Remember that fun washes these away, preventing the dye from rubbing off excessively and ensuring the final color is clear and bright. Imagine trying to wear clothes that shed blue dust everywhere you went. Not exactly a fashion statement unless you were going for the constantly molting Smurf look. After rinsing, the cloth needs to dry. This sounds simple, right? Hang it up, let the sun and wind do their thing. But the drying process is crucial for setting the final color and preparing the fabric for its eventual use or sale. Imagine vast swathes of deep blue cloth draped over drying racks lines, strung between poles, or even spread out on clean ground in the sun. The air would be thick with the smell of damp cotton and perhaps a lingering, earthy hint of the pits themselves. It's a beautiful, if slightly overwhelming visual, a landscape transformed by swathes of brilliant blue. Depending on the type of cloth and the desired finish, there might be further steps. One common technique, particularly for higher quality fabrics, was beating. Yes, you heard that right. The dried indigo cloth would be laid out and pounded with wooden mallets or heavy sticks. This wasn't an act of aggression against the fabric usually, but a way to compact the threads, give the cloth a smooth, slightly lustrous surface, and sometimes enhance the depth of the color. Think of it as the pre-industrial version of using a fancy fabric softener and an industrial press, just with more manual labor and the potential for accidental mallet-related injuries. Honey, I'm just tenderizing the trousers. Beating the cloth also made it denser and more durable, adding to its value. It was another skill the dyer or a specialist finisher possessed a technique that could transform a merely dyed piece of fabric into a desirable finished product ready for the market. You can almost hear the rhythmic thudding sound coming from the finishing area, a steady beat underpinning the whole operation. With the cloth dyed, rinsed, dried, and potentially beaten to perfection, it was finally ready to leave the production site. It transitioned from being a work in progress tied to the specific location of the pits to a portable commodity, something with inherent value that could be moved, traded, and sold far from where it was made. This is where the economic heart of the operation really starts beating loudly. The movement of the finished cloth from the dyer's workshop or compound to the marketplace was a critical step. Sometimes if the market was local, the dyer themselves might transport their finished goods. They'd bundle the cloth, perhaps load it onto a donkey, or carry it on their head and make the journey to the nearest town or village market day. You'd see them arriving, perhaps still faintly smelling of the pits, their faces showing a mixture of pride in their work and the usual anxieties of anyone heading to market. Will it sell? Will I get a good price? Will someone try to barter my favorite stirring stick for a slightly chipped pot? For dyers operating on a larger scale, or those whose markets were further afield, this step involved middlemen, traders, and transporters. Specialized porters might carry large bales of cloth. Caravans, perhaps, of donkeys, camels, especially in the north, or later carts drawn by oxen, would be assembled to move the cloth to regional centers. River transport, where available, could also be used to ship larger quantities more efficiently, floating the precious blue bundles downstream towards bustling trading towns. Imagine yourself as a weaver or a dyer, having spent weeks or months producing this cloth. You hand it over to a trader you trust, or maybe don't trust entirely. That's capitalism for you, hoping they will take it to a distant market and bring back a good return. There's a vulnerability in that transaction, a reliance on networks and relationships that stretch far beyond your immediate community. It wasn't just about making the dye. It was about participating in a complex economic ecosystem. And then the marketplace. This was the vibrant, noisy, colorful destination for the finished blue cloth. Think of a bustling market in a major city like Kano or Ibadan. The air hums with chatter in multiple languages and dialects. The smells are a mix of spices, livestock, dust, sweat, and yes, the faint distinctive aroma of indigo cloth. Stalls are set up, goods are displayed. Pottery, foodstuffs, metalwork, leather goods, and piles of textiles in every imaginable color, but with indigo blue often dominating a significant section. Your bales of cloth are laid out. The deep blues, the rich indigos, the lighter sky blues. They catch the light standing out amongst other goods. Buyers approach, local people looking for fabric for clothing tailors, seeking material for commissions, and crucially other traders looking to buy in bulk to transport the cloth further afield. This is where the value created in those quiet pits translates into tangible wealth. The quality of the cloth, the depth and fastness of the dye, the finish from the beating process. These were all scrutinized by potential buyers. A discerning customer could tell good indigo from poor. They'd examine the color uniformity, rub the fabric to check if the dye came off, the less the better, and feel the texture. This was a market where reputation and quality were paramount. A dyer known for consistently producing high-quality deep blue cloth could command better prices and attract more buyers. Conversely, a dyer with a reputation for patchy color or dye that faded quickly would struggle. Different shades of indigo cloth were produced, ranging from pale blues, requiring fewer dips, to the legendary, almost black, 7 dips indigo reserved for chiefs, and the wealthy, a symbol of status and prestige. The very deepest blues were incredibly difficult to achieve, requiring meticulous work and perfect pit conditions, making them particularly valuable. It wasn't just blue cloth. It was a spectrum of blues, each with its own value and desirability. The economic impact of this trade was immense. Indigo cloth wasn't just used locally. It was a major commodity that drove regional economies. The demand for it stretched far beyond Nigeria's borders. From the major trading hubs, the cloth flowed along ancient trade routes. Northwards across the Sahara Desert, indigo cloth was a valuable item traded for goods like salt horses and cowrie shells, linking the forest and savanna regions of West Africa with North Africa and beyond. You can imagine caravans loaded not just with golden slaves, but also with carefully bundled bolts of this deep blue fabric, traversing harsh landscapes to distant markets. Eastwards and westwards along the coast and into the interior, the cloth also traveled exchanged for goods from other regions. Cola nuts from the forest grains, from the savanna goods from European traders when they arrived on the coast. It wasn't just a product, it was currency in a way, a reliable store of value and a medium of exchange in complex trade networks. This trade supported not just the dyers and weavers, but a whole ecosystem of related professions. Those who cultivated the indigo plants, the firewood gatherers who supplied fuel for heating water, the potters who made the alkali pots, the transporters, the market traders, and the tailors who turned the cloth into clothing. It was a significant engine of economic activity for centuries. Historians still argue about the exact volume of indigo cloth traded along specific routes, particularly the trans-Saharan links. Pinning down precise numbers from centuries ago is tricky, but fragmented accounts from travelers and traders, as well as archaeological finds of indigo-dyed fragments in unexpected places along the routes, paint a picture of a trade that was both significant and widespread. It's an open scholarly debate constantly refined by new research trying to quantify just how much blue wealth flowed across the continent. Was it a trickle or a flood? Probably somewhere happily in the middle, sustaining economies without single-handedly funding empires. A quirky tidbit about the trade. In some markets, particularly for high-status cloth, the quality was so prized that specific named bundles or bolts of cloth, perhaps known for an exceptional depth of color or sheen, would develop reputations of their own, almost like individual works of art. Traders would know the names of dyers or the origins of particularly fine batches, and this information would influence prices and desirability. Imagine haggling over a piece of cloth and the seller saying, "Ah, but this isn't just any indigo. This is a 7 dips of Master Abubakar special." The economic significance isn't just about the money exchanged. It's about the integration of these communities into wider networks. The dyer in their compound wasn't isolated. They were a node in a vast network connecting farmers who grew indigo, artisans who made tools, transporters who moved goods, and traders who linked local markets to regional and international ones. Their success depended on the functioning of this whole system. You can see this in the historical records focusing on major trading cities. Mainstream historical fact cities like Kano became famous not only for their role as termini for trans-Saharan trade routes, but specifically as massive production and export centers for indigo-dyed cotton cloth known as Turkudi or other local names. The scale of production in Kano, with thousands of dyeing pits recorded, indicates an industry geared towards far more than local consumption, feeding regional and international demand for this highly valued product. These cities weren't just trading centers, they were industrial powerhouses of textile production. The competition in the marketplace could be fierce. Dyers and traders vied for customers using their skills, reputation, and perhaps even a bit of marketing flair. Haggling was, of course, a central part of the process. The buyer would examine the cloth, point out perceived flaws, real or imagined, and offer a low price. The seller would extol the virtues of their product, recount the immense effort involved in its creation true, and demand a much higher price. The dance would continue until a mutually agreeable price was reached. A process that could be drawn out and intense, fueled by chai and negotiation tactics that would make a modern sales executive weep. Think about the journey this cloth has taken. From tiny indigo seeds planted in a field nurtured under the sun, harvested, processed into dye material, mixed with ash and water in a humble pit, tended carefully through weeks of fermentation and reduction, surviving the threats of nature and error. Pulled from the pit, rinsed, dried under the sky, perhaps beaten to a perfect finish, bundled up and carried across miles through varied landscapes. Finally laid out in a noisy, dusty marketplace, ready to be bought and transformed into clothing, a symbol of wealth or a simple everyday garment. It's quite the adventure for a piece of fabric. The value wasn't just in the color itself, but in the fastness and depth of the dye, which spoke to the dyer's skill and the quality of the process. Good indigo didn't fade easily, standing up to washing and wear far better than many other natural dyes available at the time. This durability and color fastness were key selling points, making it worth the significant cost. It was an investment piece, not fast fashion. The cycle would then continue. The dyer, with the proceeds from selling the finished cloth, would buy more raw materials. More cotton yarn or woven fabric, more indigo leaves if they didn't grow their own, more wood for ash, perhaps food for their family and apprentices. Some of the profit might be reinvested in expanding the operation or improving the pits. Some would be used for other purchases in the market, feeding the broader economy. The blue cloth trade wasn't a standalone activity. It was deeply interwoven into the fabric of society and its economic systems. So next time you see a piece of deep blue fabric, maybe a pair of jeans or a shirt, take a moment to remember this history. Remember the fields of green plants, the earthy pits bubbling away, the men and sometimes women stirring the vats. The risks of disaster, the drying cloth under the sun in the bustling markets where this incredible color was transformed from a natural extract into a valuable commodity connecting communities and economies across vast distances for centuries. It's a history steeped in blue. So the cloth left the market bundled up, traded, and carried away from the dusty stalls where fortunes were made or lost. Where did it go? What was its final destination? Well, ultimately, it probably ended up on someone's back, or draped around their shoulders, or maybe even wrapped around them for eternity. Because indigo cloth wasn't just a commodity, it was first and foremost something to be worn. The primary use of this vibrant blue fabric across West Africa, and indeed far beyond, was for clothing. From simple wraps and skirts to elaborate robes and head coverings, indigo-dyed cotton was ubiquitous. You'd see it everywhere. Farmers working in the fields, merchants in the markets, rulers in their palaces, children playing in the dust. It was functional, durable, and thanks to the dye's properties, relatively color-fast, meaning it stood up to the harsh sun and repeated washing when water was available, of course. Remember that earlier struggle? Imagine the visual landscape of a town or village. While other colors existed derived from other plants, minerals, or even insects, the deep, resonant blues of indigo would have dominated. Piles of blue fabric in shops, blue-clad figures moving through the streets, drying laundry lines heavy with shades of blue. It wasn't just a color, it was a constant presence, a visual heartbeat of daily life. Different communities had different styles, of course. In some regions, people wore simple lengths of cloth wrapped around the body. In others, skilled tailors would cut and sew the fabric into more complex garments. Tunics, trousers, voluminous robes, like the famous babinriga, worn by men, or intricately styled dresses and wrappers for women. The sheer variety of clothing created from this single versatile fabric is astounding when you look at historical illustrations or modern examples of traditional dress. It's like the original fast fashion wasn't fast at all, but rather incredibly durable, painstakingly crafted, and deeply meaningful. But indigo was more than just everyday wear. It carried significant social and cultural weight. The depth of the blue in particular became a powerful signifier of status and wealth. Remember how much effort went into getting that really dark, almost black blue color. Those 7 dips or more weren't just for show. They represented a huge investment of time, labor, dye material, and skill. Think about it from an economic perspective. To achieve a light blue required fewer dips and less dye. To get a medium blue, a bit more. But to get that intense, deep indigo approaching black, you needed a perfectly maintained, pit-abundant, high-quality dye material and the patience and skill to repeatedly immerse the cloth, allowing full oxidation between dips. Each dip added color, but also took time and consumed precious resources from the pit. A truly deep blue garment wasn't just fabric, it was a condensed form of wealth and a testament to the owner's ability to acquire such a valuable product. Wearing deep indigo was a display of conspicuous consumption. It said loud and clear, "I can afford this." It wasn't just about covering your body, it was about broadcasting your position in society. Rulers, chiefs, wealthy merchants, religious leaders, they would often wear garments made from the deepest indigo, perhaps layered for even greater effect, amplifying the visual impact and the message of their status. Imagine a chief arriving at an event draped in layer upon layer of shimmering, almost black indigo cloth, catching the light and radiating an aura of power and prosperity. It would have been quite a sight, far more impressive than someone flashing a fancy watch today, though probably slightly less prone to theft, unless someone really wanted your robe. The contrast with lighter blues or undyed cloth, which was often white or cream, would have been stark. A common person might wear simple wraps of lighter indigo or even plain cotton, A wealthy person would wear complex, tailored garments of the deepest, richest blue. The visual hierarchy was clear, etched in shades of indigo. Historians still argue about the extent to which formal sumptuary laws dictating who could wear what colors or types of clothing were strictly enforced across all regions where indigo was important. While formal laws might have been sporadic or localized, social norms were incredibly powerful. Wearing a shade or style of indigo that was considered above your station could invite scrutiny, mockery, or worse. Conversely, wearing the appropriate indigo for your rank reinforced social order and identity. It was a subtle but potent form of social control and self-expression simultaneously. Beyond its use in clothing and as a status symbol, indigo cloth held cultural and spiritual significance in many societies. The color blue itself could be associated with protection, particularly against evil spirits. In some traditions, indigo cloth was used in important life cycle events, wrapping newborns, clothing initiates during rites of passage, and crucially as shrouds for the dead. Preparing the deceased in garments of deep indigo was a way of honoring them, signifying their importance in the community, and perhaps offering them protection in the journey to the afterlife. It wasn't just about sending them off in style, it was steeped in belief and tradition, a quirky or fringe tidbit related to this. In some cultures, the dyeing process itself was surrounded by ritual and superstition. Dyers might perform specific prayers or offer sacrifices to ensure the pits yielded good color and the dye was fast. The pits were seen as having a kind of life force, and treating them with respect both chemically and spiritually was essential for success. Breaking certain taboos around the pits, like allowing menstruating women near them in some traditions, was believed to spoil the dye. Whether or not it actually impacted the chemistry is debatable, but the belief certainly shaped the practice and the dyer's worldview. It wasn't just a chemical reaction, it was a sacred trust. The demand for indigo cloth also shaped agricultural practices. The need for vast quantities of indigo leaves meant that cultivation of the plant became a significant activity in many areas. It wasn't just about finding wild plants. It was about farming, about selecting seeds, preparing land, nurturing the plants, and harvesting them efficiently. This linked the textile industry directly back to the land and the people who worked it, creating another layer in the complex economic chain. Think about the skills involved in just wearing and maintaining these garments. Deep indigo cloth, especially if it hadn't been perfectly processed or if it was new, could crock, meaning excess dye would rub off. This wasn't necessarily a sign of poor quality, but could be part of the process, especially with the deepest shades. People learned how to handle these garments, perhaps washing them separately or accepting that their skin might take on a temporary blue tint, especially when sweating. It was a trade-off for the prestige of the color. Imagine getting dressed for a big event in your finest, darkest indigo robe and just hoping you don't accidentally lean on someone wearing white. The potential for accidental bluing was real. The aesthetic preferences for indigo varied too. While deep blue was often associated with status, lighter blues also had their place perhaps for everyday wear or in combination with other colors or patterns. Some regions specialized in creating patterns within the indigo dye itself, using techniques like resist dyeing, applying starch or wax to block the dye in certain areas, or tying, stitching sections of the cloth before dyeing tie-dye and stitch resist, like the famous Yoruba Adir cloth. This added another layer of complexity and artistry to the process, turning plain dyed fabric into unique works of textile art. These patterned indigo cloths were also highly valued, representing different skills and aesthetic traditions. Mainstream historical fact cities like Abeokuta and Kano became particularly renowned for their complex resist-dyed indigo textiles, producing patterns and qualities that were sought after across vast distances. The tradition of adire, dyeing in Yoruba land, for example, is a direct continuation of these historical practices, with techniques passed down through generations, demonstrating the enduring cultural significance of indigo beyond just plain cloth. It's not just history, it's a living art form. The sheer volume of indigo cloth in circulation also meant it sometimes served purposes beyond just being sewn into clothing. In some instances, carefully folded or bundled bolts of cloth could function almost as a form of currency or stored wealth, particularly before the widespread adoption of coinage or colonial currencies. You could trade cloth for other goods, knowing its value was widely recognized. It wasn't quite like carrying cash, but it was a tangible asset, portable and valuable. So when you see historical images or descriptions of West African societies, and you notice the prevalence of blue in their clothing, remember that it tells a complex story. It speaks of agriculture and industry, of long-distance trade networks, and bustling markets of skill and artistry in dyeing and tailoring, and of deep-seated cultural beliefs and social hierarchies. The blue wasn't just a color, it was a narrative woven into the very fabric of their lives. The demand wasn't static, of course. It waxed and waned with economic prosperity, political stability, or lack thereof, disrupting trade routes, and eventually the arrival of European textiles, including synthetic dyes, that offered different colors and potentially lower costs, though often lacking the depth and durability of natural indigo. But for centuries, the demand for real indigo, particularly the deep shades, remained robust, a testament to its quality, beauty, and cultural significance. The value placed on indigo was also tied to its perceived purity and natural origin. Unlike some other dyes that might involve animal products or minerals, indigo came directly from a plant processed with natural alkaline materials like ash. This might have contributed to its appeal in certain contexts beyond just the aesthetic. It was a product of the land transformed by human ingenuity and chemistry into something of great value. The next time you pull on a pair of jeans, which, let's face it, are basically descendants of historical indigo workwear and trade cloth, take a moment to appreciate the journey of that color. From a green leaf to a blue pit to a valued fabric that clothed kings, comforted the departed, and signaled status across continents. It's a history steeped not just in industry, but in identity. So you've seen the cloth woven, you've seen it plunged into the magical blue pits, dried in the sun, and brought to the marketplace where its color and quality determined its worth. You've witnessed its value in society, adorning the wealthy and signifying status. But that wasn't the end of the journey for a lot of this incredible blue textile. Far from it. The blue didn't just stay put, it moved, it traveled. Sometimes incredibly long distances across landscapes you might not imagine being connected. Imagine a bundle of that deep, deep indigo cloth, the kind that took 7 or more dips, tied securely onto the back of a camel, or perhaps balanced on the head of a tireless porter. It's leaving the relative hustle of the market town, heading out onto dusty tracks or ancient caravan routes. This cloth was currency, it was portable wealth, and it was desired far beyond the immediate region where it was made. Its journey was part of a vast, intricate network of trade that connected different parts of Africa and eventually linked Africa to other continents. Think about the logistics for a second. Moving bulk goods like textiles wasn't simple. There were no trucks, no trains, no airplanes, obviously. It was reliant on human power and animal power. Caravans of camels, donkeys, or oxen were the freight trains of the pre-modern era, capable of carrying significant loads across challenging terrain like deserts or grasslands. For shorter distances or through more difficult landscapes like forests or mountains, human porters were essential, carrying heavy loads on their backs or heads sometimes for days or weeks on end. It sounds exhausting, right? You wouldn't catch me signing up for that particular gig. My Amazon delivery would be a nightmare. These trade routes weren't just paths, they were lifelines. They stretched like veins across the continent, linking resource-rich areas with manufacturing centers, agricultural lands with bustling ports. And indigo, that deep blue marvel, was a highly sought-after commodity moving along these lines. From the dye pits of places like Kano or Zaria, bundles of cloth would head south towards the forest regions, where they might be traded for cola nuts, palm oil, or slaves. They would head east towards the shores of Lake Chad or beyond. And crucially, they would head north towards the vast, formidable Sahara Desert. The Trans-Saharan Trade Network was one of the most significant commercial arteries in world history for centuries. It connected the societies of the West African savanna and forest zones with the communities of North Africa, and through them with the wider Mediterranean world in Europe. And what was one of the key products flowing north across that sea of sand? You guessed it, gold slaves, ivory, ostrich feathers, and yes, textiles, particularly the high-quality indigo cloth. Imagine the journey. You're part of a caravan, maybe hundreds of camels strong, loaded with goods. The sun beats down relentlessly. The sand stretches out in every direction, an endless ocean of beige and gold. You rely on experienced guides who know the ancient wells, the subtle landmarks, the signs of changing weather. Nights are cool, incredibly clear, the stars like spilled glitter across a black canvas. Days are brutal. You might see other caravans, tiny dots on the horizon, or perhaps the ruins of ancient settlements, ghosts of previous journeys. It was a slow, arduous trek fraught with danger. Bandits, sandstorms, illness, simply getting lost. Not exactly your relaxing road trip playlist kind of vibe. The cities on the edge of the Sahara, places like Timbuktu Gao or Agadez, became incredible centers of trade and culture precisely because they sat at the crossroads of these routes. Goods from the south met goods from the north. Ideas, religions, and people flowed along with the commodities. Indigo cloth from Nigeria might arrive in Agadez, after weeks of travel be unbundled, inspected, maybe even traded or resold there before being loaded onto a different set of camels heading further north towards destinations like Festunis or Cairo. What did they trade for this beautiful blue cloth? A whole range of things. Salt was incredibly important, especially in areas far from the coast or salt deposits. Copper, brass, and iron often worked into bars or manufactured goods like tools or ornaments. Cowrie shells, which function as a form of currency across vast parts of West Africa. Beads often imported from places like Venice or India were highly valued for adornment. Horses particularly prized in the savannah regions. And luxury goods from the Mediterranean world, silks, finished metalware, perhaps even books or paper for the scholars in the northern cities. The trade wasn't just a simple exchange of goods. It involved complex networks of trust, credit, and negotiation. Merchants from different backgrounds, Arabs, Berbers, Hausa, Fulani, Tuareg, would meet in markets speaking multiple languages or relying on translators haggling over prices, assessing the quality of goods. The value of a bundle of indigo cloth wasn't fixed. It would fluctuate based on supply and demand, the risks involved in the journey, and the specific needs of the buyers and sellers. A mainstream historical fact here: the city of Kano, already renowned for its indigo production, became a major hub within the trans-Saharan trade network, exporting vast quantities of textiles, particularly cotton cloth, dyed blue northwards for centuries, from the medieval period right up until the early 20th century. Kano's blue cloth wasn't just consumed locally, it clothed people across the Sahara and North Africa, a testament to the scale and reach of this trade. Historians still argue about the exact quantities of indigo cloth that cross the Sahara each year. Estimating trade volumes from historical records is incredibly difficult, especially when dealing with pre-colonial African economies, where written records weren't always kept in ways easily comparable to European accounting systems. Some sources mention thousands of camel loads of textiles annually passing through major hubs, but breaking that down into specific types of cloth and dye quality is challenging. Was it tens of thousands of meters, hundreds of thousands? Enough to clothe a small city or a whole region? We know it was significant enough to make West African textiles famous in North Africa and beyond, but the precise scale remains a subject of scholarly debate and ongoing research. It's like trying to count cars on a highway using only blurry photos from a drone in the 14th century. Beyond the trans-Saharan routes, indigo also moved along other paths. River systems like the Niger and the Benue facilitated trade within the West African interior. Coastal shipping, once European traders became more involved from the 15th and 16th centuries onwards, also played a role, though initially the primary focus of coastal trade was different commodities like gold, ivory, and later enslaved people. However, indigo cloth did find its way onto these ships sometimes as trade goods themselves, and sometimes as provisions or clothing for those undertaking the horrific journeys. A quirky or fringe tidbit about this trade: in some trading communities, particular families or clans specialized in trading certain goods along specific routes. This knowledge, the routes, the wells, the prices, the people to trust and not trust, was passed down through generations. They developed elaborate codes of conduct and communication signals. Imagine a secret language just for merchants on the trans-Saharan trade. There were even specific rituals or prayers undertaken before a long journey to ensure safe passage and profitable trade, blending the practical necessities of logistics with spiritual beliefs about protection and fortune. It wasn't just business. It was a way of life steeped in tradition and risk. The value of indigo wasn't just in its practical use, it was also in its cultural significance in the destination regions. In North Africa, deep blue indigo cloth, particularly from the south, became associated with wealth and status, much like it was in its place of origin. The Tuareg people who controlled many of the central trans-Saharan routes became particularly associated with indigo. Their famous blue robes, which often dye the skin of the wearers, a distinctive blue earning them the moniker Blue Men of the Sahara, were often made from indigo cloth acquired through trade from the south. Wearing the color wasn't just aesthetic, it was integral to their identity and their role in the desert environment. The trade also wasn't always straightforward. There were tolls to pay at various points along the routes, often controlled by local rulers or powerful groups. These tolls added to the cost of the goods and were a source of revenue for those who controlled access. Conflicts could erupt, disrupting trade and making journeys incredibly dangerous. Political instability in either the source or destination regions could impact demand and supply. So while the potential profits were high, the risks were also considerable. It required bravery, resilience, and perhaps a touch of madness to be a long-distance trader in this era. Consider the ripple effect of this trade. The demand for indigo cloth in North Africa meant that the dyers and farmers in Nigeria had a market far beyond their immediate vicinity. This encouraged production, specialized skills, and investment in the indigo industry. The wealth generated from this trade flowed back into the producing regions, influencing their economies and social structures. It was a complex web of interdependence. Even further afield, West African indigo cloth sometimes made its way to Europe. While European textile production eventually dominated, particularly with the rise of industrialization, there was a time when exotic textiles from Africa, including vibrantly dyed cottons, were luxury goods in European markets. They might arrive via North Africa or later through coastal trade. These fabrics, perhaps incorporated into wealthy households or admired in port cities, were silent ambassadors of the skill and industry of the African communities who created them. The fact that a simple plant dye processed in ancient pits using techniques refined over centuries could create a product valuable enough to travel across continents, endure harsh conditions, and be desired by people of vastly different cultures is quite remarkable, isn't it? It speaks to the universal appeal of color and craftsmanship. It also highlights the sophistication of African economies and trade networks long before the major disruptions of colonialism. Imagine the stories these bundles of cloth could tell if they could talk. Stories of dusty journeys, crowded markets, tense negotiations, starry nights in the desert, changing hands multiple times, and finally ending up perhaps in a tent in the Sahara, a merchant's house in Fez, or even much later a collector's cabinet in Europe. Each fold of fabric, each shade of blue carries the imprint of that incredible journey. The demand for natural indigo and the scale of this trade network faced challenges over time. The transatlantic slave trade diverted labor and disrupted societies in many of the indigo-producing regions. The eventual European colonization imposed new economic structures and trade priorities. And perhaps most significantly for the dye industry, the development of synthetic indigo in the late 19th century provided a cheaper, more consistent alternative to the natural dye, eventually leading to the decline of many traditional indigo industries, including some of the great pit complexes. But for centuries, the blue thread of commerce connected distant lands carried on the backs of animals and the dreams of merchants. Think about that journey again, from the muddy, smelly pits to the shimmering robes worn across the Sahara. It's a transformation story, not just of a plant and a textile, but of human ingenuity, economic ambition, and the enduring power of beautiful things to traverse boundaries and connect cultures. The blue journey was long, slow, and sometimes deadly, but it was also a vital pulse of the pre-modern world, carrying not just cloth, but wealth, culture, and connection across vast distances. So you've traced that thread of blue from the humble indigo plant through the labor of cultivation, the magic, and frankly, the smell of the pits, the skill of the weavers, the bustle of the market, and the epic journeys across deserts and savannas. You've seen how incredibly valuable this blue was, how it connected economies and cultures across vast distances. But like all things, especially in the unpredictable currents of history, this golden age for natural indigo and its long-distance trade didn't last forever. Forces far away, seemingly disconnected from the rhythmic dipping in those deep pits, began to gather, and eventually they reshaped the world and the fate of traditional industries like this. The first big change, one that fundamentally altered the economic landscape of Africa, was the increasing impact of European powers. Initially, European traders were just another group operating on the fringes of the existing African trade networks, primarily along the coasts. They were interested in gold, ivory, and tragically enslaved people. But over time, their influence grew. Treaties, economic manipulation, and eventually outright military conquest led to the period known as colonialism, which intensified particularly from the late 19th century onwards. Colonial powers weren't really interested in facilitating existing African trade networks unless they served their own purposes. They wanted raw materials that their industries needed back in Europe, and they wanted markets for the manufactured goods they produced. This meant they often disrupted internal African trade patterns, redirecting resources and labor towards producing commodities like palm oil, cocoa groundnuts, or minerals, things that were in high demand in Europe. Traditional industries like ironworking, textile production, when it competed with imports, and natural dye production, often faced neglect or active discouragement if they didn't fit into the new colonial economic model. Suddenly, the focus shifted. Instead of supporting the trade of locally produced high-quality goods like indigo cloth across the Sahara, or internally colonial administrations prioritized building infrastructure, railways and roads, that connected the interior producing regions directly to the coast for export to Europe. The old trans-Saharan routes, while they didn't vanish overnight, became less commercially dominant compared to these new coastal connections. This redirection of trade routes meant that the traditional markets for Nigerian indigo cloth in North Africa and the Mediterranean became harder to access via the old channels, or the supply chains were simply less supported by the new authorities. Imagine you're a merchant who used to send caravans north. The colonial government builds a railway towards the coast instead. They might impose taxes or regulations that favor goods moving on the railway. Maybe the administrative centers are now located near the new infrastructure, drawing economic activity away from the old caravan cities. It's like suddenly everyone decides the internet is better than carrier pigeons for sending messages. The pigeons are still technically capable, but the infrastructure and the flow of communication have shifted entirely. Your pigeon-based business model is suddenly looking a bit shaky, but perhaps an even bigger blow to the natural indigo industry came not from changing trade routes, but from a laboratory in Germany. While the traditional pit dyers in Nigeria were perfecting techniques refined over centuries, chemists in Europe were busy trying to replicate nature. In the late 19th century, they succeeded. In 1897, the German chemical company BASF began industrial production of synthetic indigo. This was a game changer. Natural indigo production is labor-intensive, requires significant land for cultivation, and the quality and yield can vary depending on weather, soil, and processing techniques. Synthetic indigo, on the other hand, could be produced in large quantities in factories with consistent quality and at a much lower cost per unit of dye. It was chemically identical to the natural dye, meaning it produced the same deep blue color, but without the mess, the variability, or the reliance on agricultural cycles and artisanal production. For the burgeoning global textile industry, particularly with the rise of mass production, synthetic indigo was a dream come true. It was cheaper, more reliable, and easier to scale up. Demand for natural indigo plummeted in international markets. The European textile factories, which might have previously used imported natural indigo, perhaps even some that originated from Africa via North Africa, switched almost entirely to the synthetic version. This had a direct and devastating impact on places like Kano and other indigo-producing regions in Nigeria. The market for their high-quality natural indigo dye and cloth, especially the export market that had driven so much of the long-distance trade, began to shrink dramatically. Prices fell. It became harder for the traditional producers to compete with the flood of cheap synthetic dye arriving in coastal ports and beginning to penetrate the interior markets. Mainstream historical fact time. By the early 20th century, synthetic indigo had captured the vast majority of the global dye market. Production of natural indigo, which had been a major global commodity for centuries, produced in places ranging from India and Indonesia to Central America and West Africa, collapsed almost everywhere except in a few niche or remote markets. The speed of this transition, driven by industrial chemistry, was astonishing. Within a couple of decades, a multi-thousand-year-old global industry was effectively wiped out as a major commercial force. Imagine you're a dyer or a merchant who deals in indigo cloth. You've dedicated your life to this craft. Your family has done it for generations. You know the plants, the pit chemistry, the market fluctuations. Suddenly, this powder arrives from across the sea. It's cheaper than anything you can produce, and it works quickly. Your customers, or the merchants you sell to, start asking for the cheaper stuff. The value of your hard-won expertise, your carefully maintained pits, the years of labor in the fields, it all diminishes. It must have felt like the bottom dropped out of their world. Like someone invented teleportation, and suddenly your entire career as a taxi driver is obsolete. But my taxi has character. You might protest. Nobody cares, mate. The blue powder is cheaper and faster. The decline wasn't instantaneous or uniform everywhere. Some areas more remote from colonial infrastructure or with strong local markets might have continued traditional production for longer. The very highest quality, most deeply saturated cloths might still command a premium among those who could afford and appreciated them, like bespoke tailoring versus fast fashion. But the large-scale commercial engine that had driven the industry for centuries was sputtering. Colonial policies sometimes exacerbated this. They might impose taxes on local production or encourage the import of European manufactured goods, including textiles dyed with synthetic colors. The focus was often on extracting resources or promoting cash crops for export rather than supporting existing local industries that weren't geared towards European markets. This wasn't malicious targeting of indigo per se, more a general restructuring of the economy to serve colonial interests. But traditional crafts were collateral damage. So the pits began to fall into disuse. Without the constant demand and profitability, the intensive labor required to maintain them, to process the plants, to dip the cloth day after day, week after week, became less worthwhile. Some pits might have been abandoned, slowly filling with sand or debris, becoming hazards or just forgotten holes in the ground. Others might have continued to be used, but on a much smaller scale, perhaps just for local needs or for specific ceremonial cloths. Historians still argue about the exact timing and extent of the decline of natural indigo production in various parts of Nigeria. Was it primarily the arrival of synthetic dyes that killed the export market? Or was it the restructuring of trade routes under colonialism that choked off access to traditional buyers? How much did local demand persist? Did some regions adapt better than others, pinpointing the precise weight of each factor? Synthetic competition, colonial policy, changing tastes, economic shifts is complex. Records are patchy, and the decline happened gradually over several decades, affecting different communities in different ways. It wasn't like a light switch turning off. It was more like a long, slow sunset, a quirky or fringe tidbit here. Even as the commercial production for export declined, the cultural significance of indigo blue persisted in many communities. Certain patterns, certain shades of blue were still associated with specific status ceremonies or identity. So even if the cloth was now dyed with cheaper synthetic powder or imported, the meaning of the color remained powerful. In some places, particularly among groups like the Tuareg mentioned earlier, the tradition of wearing indigo-dyed cloth remained incredibly strong, becoming an even more defining visual characteristic even if the dye source had changed. The pits might be quieter, but the blue story wasn't entirely over. The skills associated with natural dyeing also began to fade. As profitability decreased, fewer young people might have been drawn to the profession. The intricate knowledge of fermentation times, plant varieties, ash mixtures, and dipping techniques passed down through generations became less essential for economic survival. This traditional knowledge, a sophisticated form of applied chemistry and biology, was slowly being eroded by the forces of global industrialization and economic change. It's like losing the recipe for grandmother's secret sauce because everyone just buys ketchup now. The sauce is better, but the market doesn't care. You can imagine the atmosphere around the pits changing. The vibrant energy of constant activity, the rhythmic dipping, the lively chatter of workers, the haggling of merchants. Much of that would have diminished. Perhaps some pits remained in use by older generations, clinging to the traditional ways, while the younger ones sought livelihoods in the new colonial economy, working on plantations, migrating to coastal cities, or engaging in new forms of trade. The legacy of these pits, even in decline, is physical. Many still exist today, often as deep circular holes in the ground, sometimes overgrown with vegetation, sometimes partially filled in. They are silent witnesses to a different era, a time when West African ingenuity and labor produced a commodity that clothed people across continents and fueled vast trade networks. They are archaeological reminders of a sophisticated pre-industrial economy. The economic forces were powerful, relentless. Synthetic indigo offered predictability scale and price advantages that artisanal natural dyeing simply couldn't match in a global market increasingly driven by mass production and cost efficiency. Colonial structures further disadvantaged local production that didn't fit their export model. It was a double whammy for the traditional indigo pit industry. So while the romance of the trans-Saharan journey and the vibrant markets was the peak of the story, the decline is also a crucial part. It's the story of how external forces, chemistry from European labs, and economic policies from European capitals, reached into the heart of local African industries and fundamentally changed them. It's a pattern repeated across the continent and indeed across the globe as traditional crafts and economies collided with the juggernaut of industrial capitalism and colonialism. The blue thread didn't snap entirely, but it frayed and thinned considerably, leaving many of the once bustling pit sites to become quieter, less significant spaces, holding the memory of their former glory in their silent depths. So the blue retreated. The tidal wave of synthetic dye and the changing currents of colonial trade left the once thriving pits quieter, less essential. They didn't all vanish overnight, of course. Nothing in history happens that cleanly. But the rhythm changed. The constant backbreaking labor of stirring, dipping, and draining for a massive commercial market dwindled. And what remains today, you might imagine crumbling ruins, carefully preserved heritage sites, or maybe just nothing. The reality is often a mix, and frankly, sometimes just nothing much is closer to the truth in many places. Today, many of the thousands of pits that once pockmarked the landscape around cities like Kano and in countless smaller villages across indigo-growing regions exist primarily as archaeological features. They are depressions in the ground, often circular, sometimes lined with decaying mud brick or remnants of plaster slowly succumbing to entropy. They are quite literally holes in the ground. Some are shallow, partially filled with sand leaves or refuse. Others are still surprisingly deep, potentially hazardous if you aren't watching your step. Imagine stepping into a centuries-old industrial vat by accident while walking through a field. That would certainly wake you up, which isn't ideal for a sleep podcast, so let's stick to imagining it safely from here. Think about the earth around Kano, for example, especially in older parts of the city or on its historical outskirts. If you were to fly over or look at old aerial photos, or even just know where to look on the ground, you might spot clusters of these circular depressions. They are scars on the landscape, faint echoes of a time when that ground was constantly worked, stirred, and steeped in the rich, earthy, fermenting smell we talked about earlier. Remember that powerful aroma? It's mostly gone now, thankfully for modern noses. Maybe sadly for historical purists. In some places, particularly in urban areas like Kano, the pits have been built over. The city has grown expanded and modern structures now stand where busy dye yards once hummed with activity. The pits might still be there buried beneath foundations, concrete, or tarmac. Hidden history literally underfoot. Imagine walking down a busy street completely unaware that 30 feet below you lies a preserved pit, maybe still holding centuries-old indigo residue, a time capsule of blue. It's kind of a weird thought, isn't it? Like walking over a sunken ship or an underground city. Though probably less dramatic, more like walking over someone's really old, really smelly bathtub. In rural areas where the pressure of urban development is less intense, the pits are often more visible. They might be in fields near old village sites or along ancient pathways. Over the decades, vegetation has taken hold. Weeds grow around their rims, sometimes even inside them. Trees might sprout nearby. The earth around them might be darker stained by centuries of indigo dye being spilled or draining away. They blend into the landscape, becoming just another feature perhaps noticed by local farmers or children playing, but their original purpose increasingly forgotten or misunderstood. This fading memory is a crucial part of their story now. The generations who actively worked the pits, who knew the intricacies of the craft, who understood the economic significance of the blue thread, are passing on. Their children and grandchildren grew up in a world dominated by synthetic dyes, imported textiles, and a different economy. The stories might become less detailed, The specific names of the dyers, less remembered. The techniques, less understood. The pits themselves transition from being active workplaces to being geographical markers points in a landscape, sometimes given new unrelated names or incorporated into local folklore in ways that might distort their original purpose. It's like remembering how to use a rotary phone. Your grandparents probably knew it intimately, maybe even fixed one. Your parents might remember having one. You might have seen one in a museum. Your kids probably wouldn't even know what the dial is for. That's the speed at which practical knowledge fades when the technology or industry disappears. The pits are the physical rotary phones of the indigo world. There's a sense of quietness around these sites today. The constant dipping, the stirring, the splashing, the voices, all that energy is gone. You might hear the wind whistling over the rim, the rustle of dry grass, perhaps the distant sound of a vehicle or modern farming equipment. The air doesn't carry that pungent, unique scent anymore. It's just the smell of dust earth and whatever crops might be growing nearby. The silence speaks volumes about the scale of change that has occurred. A mainstream historical fact here: archaeological surveys have been conducted at some historical pit sites, particularly in and around Kano, providing valuable insights into the construction techniques, scale of operation, and types of materials used. These surveys, often involving collaboration with local communities, help document these features before they are completely lost to time or development. These efforts are crucial for understanding the scale of this pre-colonial industry and its significance in the regional economy. So while some pits are forgotten, others are being scientifically studied, trying to piece together the story from the physical remnants. It's like detectives examining clues left behind by a massive centuries-old party. Historians still argue about the exact total number of pits that existed at the peak of the industry, especially across the vast indigo-producing regions beyond the major centers like Kano. Estimating the scale of production from the scattered remains of pits is incredibly challenging. Were there tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands across West Africa? Were the techniques uniform, or did they vary significantly from village to village, family to family? The patchy archaeological record and the fading oral traditions make definitive answers difficult. It's one of those things that might remain a matter of scholarly debate for a long time, perhaps forever. Imagine walking around one of these sites today. Maybe you see a cluster of 3 or 4 depressions close together, remnants of a family's dye yard. You might notice how the ground slopes slightly towards the pits, maybe designed to catch rainwater or runoff. You might see broken pottery shards nearby, perhaps pieces of the vessels used to carry the dye or water. The earth feels dry and warm under the sun. It's hard to conjure the vibrant scene of activity that was once here. The wet cloth being hung to dry, the deep blue color deepening in the sun, the smells, the sounds. Sometimes these pits have been repurposed, though rarely for anything involving dye. Some might be used as convenient places to dump waste, sadly. Others might simply be obstacles in a field. In some areas, if they are deep enough and hold water seasonally, they might become watering holes for animals, providing a small ecological niche in the landscape. A former industrial site transformed into a mini pond for goats. History has a strange sense of humor, a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some rural communities, deep old pits that are no longer used for dyeing have become part of local legends or superstitions. People might avoid them after dark, believing they are inhabited by spirits or that they lead to underground passages. This transformation from a mundane, though laborious industrial site to a place of mystery and folklore is fascinating. The practical memory fades, but the physical presence remains, allowing new narratives to take root, often completely disconnected from the reality of indigo fermentation and cloth dipping. It's like telling ghost stories about an abandoned factory instead of talking about its production quotas. The sheer scale of abandonment is also part of the story. It wasn't just a few workshops closing. It was a massive regional industry undergoing a rapid, externally driven collapse. This left behind not just abandoned pits, but also a loss of livelihood for vast numbers of people. The cultivators, the dyers, the stirrers, the weavers, who relied on the local dye, the merchants, the transporters. The silent pits are monuments to this economic and social disruption, a physical manifestation of a changing world order that prioritized European industrial output and colonial resource extraction over established African economies and crafts. Even in places where traditional dyeing continued on a smaller scale, perhaps for local ceremonial use or niche markets, the number of active pits would have drastically reduced. Maintaining a pit is hard work. If you're not using it constantly, it deteriorates. Linings crack, walls collapse, debris falls in. The investment of labor required to keep a pit in working order is significant. Without consistent economic return, many would have simply been left to the elements. The pits are witnesses not only to the peak of the industry, but also to its decline and the subsequent silence. They stand, or rather sit, as quiet reminders of a time when Nigerian blue was a valuable commodity that traveled across continents. They remind us that technological change and global economic forces have profound local impacts, reshaping landscapes and erasing memories of past ways of life. They are the physical embodiment of a forgotten chapter, waiting for someone to notice the subtle depression in the ground and wonder what it could have been. The fading memory isn't just about people forgetting what the pits were. It's also about forgetting the processes that happened there. The specific recipes for the ash mixture, the timing for aeration, the signs that the fermentation was going well or badly. This deep, practical scientific knowledge honed over centuries is much harder to preserve than the simple fact that there were holes where they made dye. It's losing the how-to manual, not just the cover. So next time you see a picture of a seemingly random hole in the ground in certain parts of West Africa, or read about archaeological work on historical sites, maybe you'll think of the indigo pits. You'll think of the incredible industry, the vibrant blue, the hard labor, and the complex history that led to these silent, often forgotten witnesses of a blue past. They are still there, quietly holding on to their secrets, waiting for someone to remember. So the pits fell silent, yes. The large-scale industry dwindled, leaving those quiet depressions in the earth that we were just contemplating. But history, much like a particularly stubborn indigo stain, doesn't always disappear completely, even when you try to scrub it out. While the vast commercial engine that powered the thousands of pits sputtered and died under the weight of colonial policy and synthetic competition, the knowledge of indigo dyeing didn't vanish overnight. The skills, the recipes, the connection to the plant and the process, these were deeply ingrained in the culture, passed down through generations. Think of it this way, just because everyone started driving cars didn't mean nobody knew how to ride a horse anymore. The horse might not be your primary mode of transport for delivering vast quantities of goods across continents, but someone somewhere still knew how to saddle one up, knew its gaits, knew its moods. The same is true for indigo. Even as the mass market evaporated, pockets of traditional practice persisted. Families who had dyed for centuries might continue dyeing cloth for local use for important ceremonies, or for specific garments that just had to be the traditional blue. This persistence wasn't about competing with the industrial world. It was about identity, tradition, and a preference for quality that synthetic couldn't replicate. The depth and nuance of color achieved with natural indigo, the way it aged and faded gracefully, the connection to the earth and the community. These were values that transcended pure economics for some. It became a craft again, perhaps more than an industry. Smaller batches, fewer pits, maybe even just a few pots, and tubs in a backyard rather than the vast humming yards of the past. And then over time, something else began to happen. A growing interest in heritage and traditional crafts and natural materials. The global fascination with authentic textiles and sustainable practices created new, albeit smaller markets. People both within Nigeria and internationally started looking back, recognizing the incredible skill and history embedded in these forgotten crafts. This led to attempts at revival. These revival efforts take many forms. Sometimes it's older generations trying to pass on their knowledge to younger ones who grew up with little exposure to the process. Sometimes it's cultural organizations or museums documenting the techniques before they disappear entirely. And sometimes it's entrepreneurs and artisans inspired by the beauty of the traditional blue, trying to recreate it for a modern market, often targeting consumers interested in slow fashion, handmade goods, and cultural heritage. Imagine a young artisan today maybe working not with a massive pit, but with a series of much smaller vats or tanks. They're trying to source the indigo leaves, carefully measure the ash, initiate the fermentation. They might be learning from an elder, deciphering old notes, or even experimenting based on documented processes. It's a different pace, a different scale. Instead of dyeing hundreds of lengths of fabric a day, they might be carefully dyeing individual scarves pieces for bespoke clothing or wall hangings. The challenges are immense. Firstly, sourcing the raw materials. While indigo plants still grow, finding consistent, high-quality sources for a revival movement can be tricky, especially after decades of reduced demand. Then there's the knowledge itself, the specific, often unwritten nuances of the process. How do you know when the fermentation is just right? What does the perfect indigo vat smell actually smell like compared to something gone wrong? Let's hope it's less potent than the large-scale historical version we pictured. Maybe a slightly less challenging smell to get used to. There's also the sheer labor involved. Revival attempts often run into the same wall. The historical process faced its incredibly hard work. Lifting heavy bundles of wet cloth, stirring thick vats. It's not a casual hobby. Modern artisans have to reconcile the romantic idea of traditional craft with the physical reality of it. It makes you appreciate those historical stirs even more, doesn't it? They weren't just making blue, they were getting a serious workout. The market is another hurdle. While there's interest convincing consumers to pay a premium price for traditionally dyed textiles, which are inherently more expensive and slower to produce than factory-dyed alternatives, is a constant effort. It requires telling the story, educating the buyer about the history, the skill, and the value. You're not just selling a blue shirt, you're selling centuries of heritage, a piece of living history. And maybe a tiny whiff of fermented plant matter if you're really authentic. Kidding mostly, probably. Despite the difficulties, these revival attempts are incredibly important. They keep the knowledge alive, provide livelihoods for artisans, and reconnect people with a significant part of their history. They transform the perception of indigo dyeing from a forgotten industry memorialized by holes in the ground to a vibrant living art form. A mainstream historical fact relevant here. The resilience of craft traditions in West Africa, even in the face of intense external economic pressure, is a documented phenomenon. Many traditional crafts, including various forms of weaving pottery and metalwork, adapted or persisted on a smaller scale sustained by local cultural needs and niche markets, rather than disappearing entirely as mass-produced imports became dominant. Indigo dyeing in its artisan form fits into this broader pattern of cultural and economic resilience. You might see examples of this today in tourist markets, cultural festivals, or online stores specializing in African textiles. You might encounter artisans demonstrating the process, perhaps not with a huge permanent pit, but with portable vats showing how the cloth comes out green and oxidizes to blue in the air. Remember that magic moment. These are living links to the past people who are actively choosing to keep the flame of the blue pits burning, albeit perhaps as a small campfire rather than a raging furnace. Historians still argue about the extent to which modern traditional indigo dyeing truly replicates the colors and processes of the pre-colonial peak. Are modern recipes and techniques precisely the same as those used to produce the enormous quantities for export? Have they been altered or simplified over time? The lack of detailed written records from centuries past, coupled with the inevitable evolution of oral traditions and practices, makes it difficult to say with certainty whether a piece dyed today perfectly matches the blue of a garment from 1850. It's a fascinating debate about authenticity and continuity in craft traditions. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some modern artisans experimenting with traditional indigo are rediscovering or reinterpreting old techniques, sometimes even using unexpected organic materials mentioned in historical accounts or oral traditions to influence the fermentation process or the color shade. This might involve adding specific fruits, tree bark, or even animal products that were once part of complex recipes, pushing the boundaries of what we might consider standard dyeing ingredients today. It's like finding a hidden ingredient in your grandma's secret cookie recipe. Turns out, a pinch of something weird makes all the difference. These revival efforts are not just about producing textiles, they are also about cultural preservation and economic empowerment. For communities where indigo cultivation and dyeing were central to their identity and economy, bringing the craft back, even on a smaller scale, can be a source of pride and a way to generate income, particularly in areas where other economic opportunities are limited. It's turning a forgotten history into a potential future. Think about the difference in motivation. The historical stirs were driven by mass production, by the need to meet huge export quotas, by the sheer volume of trade. The modern artisan is often driven by passion, by a connection to heritage, by the desire to create something beautiful and meaningful by hand. The blue connects them across centuries, but their context is vastly different. You might encounter textiles today where the blue has a subtle variation, a slight unevenness, or a depth that feels different from mass-produced fabric. That might be your clue that you're looking at something dyed with natural indigo, using traditional or revived techniques. It's not necessarily perfect in the sense of industrial uniformity, but its beauty lies precisely in that handmade quality, the slight imperfections that tell the story of its creation. The journey from thousands of humming pits to silent depressions, and then to small-scale revival attempts, reflects a massive societal shift. It shows how global forces can dismantle established local economies, but also how human ingenuity and cultural memory can find ways to adapt, preserve, and recreate. The blue endures, changing its form and context, but holding on to its essence. These modern artisans are in a way the new stirrers keeping the vats alive. Their vats might be smaller, the scale less grand, but the core principle is the same, unlocking the magic within the indigo plant to create that beautiful deep blue. They are navigating the complexities of the 21st century using social media to reach global markets, while simultaneously drawing on knowledge that is centuries old. It's a blend of ancient craft and modern entrepreneurship. Imagine the conversations today comparing notes on fermentation temperature via WhatsApp, perhaps, rather than shouting across a busy dye yard. Seeking advice from an elder living in a different village. Researching historical techniques online. The tools and communication methods have changed drastically, but the fundamental challenge of getting that vat just right remains. The revival of traditional crafts like indigo dyeing is a global trend, part of a wider movement valuing handmade, sustainable, and culturally significant products. Nigeria's indigo tradition, with its deep history and unique characteristics, is finding its place within this movement. It's a hopeful sign that the story of the blue pits isn't just about decline and silence, but also about resilience and rebirth. The ghosts of the ancient stirrers might even approve. You've got this thriving, vibrant, slightly smelly vat of potential blue. You've seen the dyer stirring it, keeping the chemistry alive. Now it's time for the payoff, the transformation that turns plain cloth into something magnificent. This is where the textile actually enters the picture, moving from simple woven fiber to a canvas for this ancient color. Imagine the dyer, or perhaps an assistant, holding lengths of fabric. Often this would have been cotton-grown, locally spun into thread, and woven into lengths of cloth right there in Kano, or the surrounding areas. Cotton takes the dye beautifully and holds the color well, which is part of why Kano became such a textile hub. You might be holding one end of a long piece yourself, feeling the rough texture of the hand-woven cotton. The process starts with dipping the fabric into the dye bath. It's not a gentle lowering, it's often a forceful plunging. The dyer pushes the cloth down into the liquid using the stirring pole, or another stick, ensuring it is fully submerged. You need to get every single fiber saturated with that indoxyl-rich liquid. As the cloth goes in, you see the greenish, yellowish-black liquid soak into it. When it's completely submerged, perhaps bubbling slightly as the trapped air escapes, it sits there for a while. How long? That depends on the desired shade, the strength of the bath, and the dyer's experience. It could be minutes, maybe longer. While it's submerged, the fibers are soaking up the soluble indoxyl molecules. But remember, the indoxyl isn't blue. So when the dyer pulls the fabric out of the pit, it doesn't instantly appear vibrant blue. Instead, it might look greenish yellowish, or even a dull muddy brown, depending on the concentration of the bath and how long it was submerged. It's wet, heavy, and probably dripping with the pungent dye liquid. Here's where the real magic happens, the part that feels almost like a reveal. As the dripping fabric is lifted into the air, you watch closely. It starts to change color, slowly at first, then more visibly. The greenish or yellowish tint begins to deepen, shifting towards green, then teal, then a developing blue. It's the oxygen in the air doing its work. As the indoxyl molecules that have permeated the cloth encounter oxygen, they link together and oxidize, forming the insoluble indigo pigment. Think of it like watching a photographic print develop in a darkroom bath, if you're old enough to remember those, or if you've seen it in a movie. The image slowly appears on the paper. Here the color slowly appears on the cloth. It's a transformation right before your eyes triggered simply by contact with the atmosphere. It's a bit like those mood rings that change color with temperature, but instead of your body heat, it's the air causing the chemical reaction. Witnessing ancient chemistry live and in person. Bet your science class never had this much drama? The change isn't instantaneous, but it's usually fairly quick once the fabric is fully exposed. You can see the color spreading and intensifying as the fabric is held up, or perhaps draped over a frame or pole next to the pit. The dyer might manipulate the cloth slightly to ensure even air exposure. The fabric might still be dripping, staining the ground around the pits with streaks of liquid that then turn blue themselves as they hit the air. Now here's the key to getting that deep, rich, famous Kano blue one. Dip is almost never enough. A single dip and airing will produce a relatively pale blue. To achieve deeper shades, the fabric needs to be dipped multiple times. So after the first airing, the cloth is plunged back into the pit for a second dip. It comes out looking greenish, marsh yellowish again, and then the oxidation process repeats, deepening the blue hue already deposited on the fibers. This cycle is repeated over and over. Dip, lift, air, 5 times, 10 times, 20 times, sometimes even more. Each dip adds more layers of indigo pigment to the fibers, making the color progressively darker and more intense. This repetitive process is incredibly labor-intensive. You're handling heavy wet cloth repeatedly, lifting, plunging, lifting, draping. Your arms would get tired, your back would ache. Your hands would likely be permanently stained a deep, beautiful blue. The dyer's skill wasn't just in maintaining the bath. It was also in knowing how many dips were needed to achieve a specific shade and ensuring the dips were even and consistent across the entire length of fabric. An uneven dip or airing would result in patchy color, ruining the cloth's value. It required a careful eye and steady hands, especially when dealing with long lengths of fabric. Imagine trying to get a perfectly consistent dark blue on a piece of cloth 50 feet long by dipping it 20 times by hand. That's dedication, or maybe just really needed that specific shade of blue. Just one more dip, just one more. Okay, maybe, just one more. I swear this is the last one before my arms fall off. This multi-dip process is why high-quality Kano indigo cloth was so prized. The depth and richness of the blue color were direct indicators of the amount of work and valuable indigo pigment that had gone into creating it. A pale blue might signify fewer dips, less pigment, and less labor, thus less value. A deep, almost black blue known as tuwanjaki, meaning donkey's food in Hausa, perhaps humorously referencing its density or the labor involved, was the most highly valued, representing countless hours of dipping and airing. You can see the different stages around the pits. Some fabrics might be hanging up after only a few dips, showing lighter shades of blue. Others destined for that prized tuwanjaki might be going through their 15th or 20th dip, already a deep dark color even before the final airing. The ground around the pits is likely stained in gradients of blue, a testament to the hundreds of pieces of cloth processed there over the years. Historians still argue whether the specific shade of Kano blue was unique solely due to the Indigofera species used the other additives in the bath or the sheer number of dips traditionally performed. It's one of those open scholarly debates. Was it the raw materials, the recipe, or the process, or a combination that created the distinctive and celebrated Kano blue? It's likely a complex interplay, but the dedication to multiple dips certainly played a major role in achieving that characteristic depth. A quirky tidbit about the process: sometimes after dipping and before the final drying, the fabric would be pounded. Using wooden mallets or heavy stones, the dyers would beat the wet cloth. This wasn't just to get the water out. It was believed to help force the indigo pigment deeper into the fibers, making the color more permanent and giving the fabric a slight sheen or crushed texture. It also compacted the cloth slightly. Imagine the sound. A rhythmic thudding accompanying the sloshing of the stirring and the quiet murmur of activity around the pits. Thud, 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 another layer of effort adding to the value. The mainstream historical fact here is the sheer scale of indigo dyeing in Kano. It wasn't just a few people doing it. It was a major industry involving thousands of people. Historical accounts from travelers like Heinrich Barth in the mid-19th century described the dyeing quarter of Kano with immense numbers of pits and dyers at work. This industrial-scale craft production was a key engine of Kano's economy and its participation in long-distance trade networks. These pits weren't just local curiosities. They were part of a vast, intricate economic system stretching across continents. They were manufacturing centers producing goods that were in high demand from the Sahara to the Mediterranean and beyond. The air around you beyond the immediate smell of fermentation also carries the faint, slightly metallic scent of the oxidation process itself. It's the smell of chemistry happening in real time on a large scale. You might also smell the drying cloth, a more subtle scent of wet fabric infused with pigment and organic matter. The rhythm of the work would have been cyclical, tied to the preparation of the bath, the harvesting of indigo, the arrival of woven cloth, and the market demand. There might be periods of intense activity with dyers working from dawn till dusk, and other times when baths were being prepared or left to ferment. Standing here, watching the fabric transform from a dull, damp cloth into a piece of deep, luminous blue, you gain an appreciation for the artistry and the labor involved. It wasn't just a chemical process, it was a craft honed over centuries, requiring patience, strength, and a deep understanding of the materials. The dyers were skilled artisans, their knowledge passed down through generations, their work creating a product that was famous across vast distances. It makes you look at a piece of indigo-dyed fabric differently, doesn't it? Knowing the sun, the plant, the bacteria, the human effort, the countless dips and airings that went into creating that color, it's not just blue. It's history, chemistry, and hard work woven into the fibers. It's a reminder that even the simplest things like a color on cloth can have incredibly rich and complex stories behind them. The fabric dripping and still damp from its countless dips and final airings is heavy. It smells less intensely of the fermentation now, and more of the dried indigo pigment itself. An earthy, slightly metallic, perhaps even sweet aroma once it's properly oxidized. It hangs perhaps draped over wooden frames or poles or spread out on specific drying grounds near the pits, shimmering in the sunlight with that newly born blue. You can see the variations in shade across the drying area from the pale sky blues of cloth intended for local wear to the deep dark, almost navy or even black of the Tuwan jockey, the most prized textile. Drying is another crucial step. It needs to happen evenly, ideally in the sun, but not so fast that it affects the final color depth. Once dry, the fabric is much lighter, but the color is now permanent, locked into the fibers through that miraculous oxidation process you witnessed. The texture might feel different too, perhaps slightly stiffer than undyed cloth, especially the heavily dyed pieces, or maybe with that subtle sheen if it was pounded as you heard. It feels solid, substantial, like a product of real effort and value. The lengths of cloth, once dry, are carefully folded and prepared for market. This might involve smoothing them, perhaps pressing them in some way, and then folding them into standardized sizes or bundles. The way cloth was folded and presented could also be a mark of quality or origin, a subtle language understood by traders and consumers. Imagine bundles of varying shades of blue stacked neatly, waiting to begin their journey. The darkest ones would fetch the highest prices, their deep color, a visible symbol of the labor and pigment that went into them. From the dyeing pits, the finished indigo cloth didn't just sit around. Kano was a major trading hub, and this textile was one of its star products. The market, or Kasuwa, would have been a bustling, vibrant place. Picture it, smells of spices, leather food, livestock, and of course the distinctive scent of indigo cloth mingling in the hot air. Sounds of haggling, shouting animals, the murmur of countless conversations in different languages. You'd see people from all over. Local Hausa traders, Tuareg caravaneers, merchants from across the Sahara, possibly even those linked to coastal trade networks. The indigo cloth was traded locally within Kano and the surrounding Hausa states. People needed clothing, and blue was a highly favored color, often associated with status and wealth, especially the darker shades. But the real economic power of Kano indigo lay in its role in long-distance trade. This wasn't just for local consumption, it was an export commodity of significant value. It traveled north across the Sahara Desert along the ancient trans-Saharan trade routes. Think about the sheer scale of this trade. Caravans of camels, sometimes numbering in the thousands, would depart from cities like Kano loaded with goods. While gold and slaves were other infamous commodities of this trade, textiles, particularly indigo-dyed cloth, were consistently important cargo, especially on the southbound journey bringing finished goods to West Africa. But Kano's indigo went north. It was traded for goods that were not available locally. Salt from the Sahara, absolutely essential metals, cowrie shells used as currency, glass beads, paper, luxury items, and horses. Imagine a caravan preparing to leave Kano, maybe just outside the city walls. Camels kneeling patiently, or not so patiently, they're notoriously grumpy, being loaded with heavy bales of cloth. Each bale carefully wrapped perhaps in leather or coarse matting to protect the precious cargo from dust, sand, and the elements during the long journey. The air filled with commands, the grunts and complaints of camels, the jingle of their bells, the dry rustle of fabric being secured. It wasn't a quick trip. Traveling across the Sahara could take weeks or even months depending on the destination and the conditions. Okay, everyone loaded up, got your water skins. Remember we turned left at the big dune shaped like a grumpy camel? See you in Timbuktu. The destinations for Kano Indigo were varied. It went to other centers in West Africa like Timbuktu and Jenny, integrating into those local economies and trade networks. It went across the desert to North African cities like Gadamsgat, Tunis, Tripoli, and even as far north as Cairo and the Mediterranean coast. From there, some of it might have been traded further into the Ottoman Empire or even Europe, though the bulk likely stayed within North Africa and the Sahara, highly valued by the Berber and Arab populations there. Why was Kano indigo so popular and valuable? Several reasons. Firstly, the color itself. Indigo blue was desirable across many cultures. In the Sahara, it was particularly prized by the Tuareg people, whose iconic blue veils and robes, often dyed with indigo, became a symbol of their identity and nomadic lifestyle. The dye rubbed off slightly onto the skin, giving it a bluish tint, seen not as a stain, but a mark of status and wealth, proof that you wore genuine rich indigo. They were the blue people partly because of this Kano dye. Secondly, the quality. The deep, rich, fast colors achieved through the multi-dip process were superior to many other indigo textiles available. The durability of the color meant the fabric would hold its vibrant blue through repeated washing and harsh sun. Thirdly, scale and consistency. Kano produced vast quantities of this cloth consistently year after year, century after century. This made it a reliable source for traders. The production process, while ancient, was also highly organized, involving specialists at each stage. Farmers growing indigo, weavers producing cloth dyers in their pits, and merchants facilitating the trade. A mainstream historical fact here is the sheer volume and longevity of Kano's textile trade. For centuries, well before European colonial powers arrived, and significantly after Kano was renowned across North and West Africa, primarily for its cotton textiles, with indigo-dyed cloth being the most famous and valuable export. Travelers' accounts from the 15th century onwards consistently mention Kano's thriving cloth industry and its export northwards. This wasn't a flash-in-the-pan trade. It was a cornerstone of the regional economy for half a millennium or more. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit related to this trade, sometimes beyond the cloth itself, indigo dye was traded in other forms. While the finished cloth was the main export, indigo paste or dried cakes of dye were also occasionally transported, though the logistics of keeping the paste viable or dealing with the dried cakes were more complex than trading finished cloth. This wasn't as common or as large scale as the cloth trade, but it indicates the value wasn't just in the finished product, but also in the raw coloring power of the indigo itself. Imagine trading little blue bricks across the desert. Probably less appealing than beautifully folded cloth, but still a commodity. Historians still argue whether the peak period of Kano indigo production and trade occurred before or after certain key events, like the full establishment of the Sokoto Caliphate in the early 19th century, or the later disruptions caused by European colonialism. It's an open scholarly debate. Pinning down the exact golden age is tricky due to the nature of historical records, which are often incomplete or biased. Was it at its height when the trans-Saharan trade was freest and most robust? Or did internal political stability under the Caliphate allow it to flourish even more before external pressures mounted? It's a complex question with different interpretations. The legacy of Kano indigo is immense. It didn't just represent economic activity, it became part of the cultural identity of Kano and the wider region. The skill of dyeing was passed down through generations, often within specific families or guilds. The famous Kofar Mata dye pits, which you've been exploring, are the most prominent surviving example recognized as a historical landmark and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, or part of the nominated Kano cultural landscape. Even today, though facing challenges from modern dyeing techniques and cheaper imports, traditional dyeing using the pits continues a living link to this ancient craft and trade. Walking through the market in Kano today, you can still find indigo-dyed cloth, sometimes produced using traditional methods, sometimes modern imitations. The smell might evoke faint echoes of the past. The sight of vibrant blue fabric in a market stall carries centuries of history within its folds. Stories of dyers stirring vats of caravaneers, crossing dunes of merchants, haggling over prices of people across a vast continent wearing this distinctive, beautiful color. The demand wasn't limited to the Sahara and North Africa. Portuguese and later other European traders operating on the West African coast were also interested in local textiles, including indigo cloth, though the coastal trade routes were different from the trans-Saharan ones. However, the vast quantities produced in Kano primarily flowed north until much later periods. The trade networks themselves fostered cultural exchange. Along with the cloth, ideas, technologies, religions, Islam spread along these routes and people traveled. The indigo dye pits of Kano weren't just factories. They were nodes in a vast interconnected world. Their product contributed to the wealth of Kano's rulers, fueled the livelihoods of thousands of people, and clothed populations across half a continent. Thinking about those camel caravans laden with blue fabric trudging across the endless desert, it's quite a thought, isn't it? A silent testament to the power of human ingenuity and labor, transforming a simple plant into a global commodity. It reminds you that global trade isn't a new concept invented in the last few centuries. It's something humans have been doing for millennia, often using methods that seem incredibly arduous by today's standards. No container ships, no airplanes, just camels, courage and high-quality blue cloth. Yep, just packing the camels, hope nobody gets lost or eaten by a giant sandworm. Standard Tuesday. The value placed on this cloth meant that dyers held a respected position in society. Their skill was valuable, their knowledge guarded. They weren't just manual laborers. They were artisans practicing a complex craft rooted in chemistry and tradition. The pits were their workshops, the source of their livelihood, and their contribution to the city's prosperity. Even the term indigo itself has a history tied to trade. It comes from Greek meaning from India, reflecting one of the original sources of indigo dye plants traded into the Mediterranean world in ancient times. But by the time Kano's pits were in full swing, local indigofera species were the source, creating a distinctively African indigo trade that rivaled or surpassed imports in its sphere of influence. The deep connection between Kano and indigo dyeing is undeniable. The city's history, economy, and even its visual identity are intertwined with this blue pigment and the ancient pits where it was made. It's more than just a historical footnote. It's a living legacy, a craft that has endured through significant changes and continues to hold cultural significance. The pit's quiet now in the late evening represents centuries of continuous production, a rare example of a pre-industrial manufacturing process that sustained a major urban center and influenced trade across a vast geographical area. They are monuments to human skill, endurance, and the enduring allure of a particular shade of blue. You've traced the journey of indigo from a humble plant through complex processes, watched it bloom in the pits, and imagined its long trek across the desert, clothing people and building economies for centuries. But history, like a great river, constantly flows, changing its course and encountering new obstacles. While the story of Kano indigo reached incredible heights, the 20th century brought significant shifts that began to alter the landscape for these ancient dye pits and the men who stirred them. The primary challenge came with the arrival of new technologies and materials. Before the late 19th century, natural dyes were essentially the only game in town for vibrant, permanent colors. Indigo, cochineal madder weld. These were the sources of color for textiles around the world. But then chemists started experimenting with coal tar and other substances, leading to the discovery and synthesis of artificial or synthetic dyes. The first synthetic indigo was synthesized in the late 1800s, and by the early 20th century it was being produced industrially on a massive scale. Synthetic indigo offered significant advantages. It was cheaper to produce, the dyeing process could be standardized and completed faster, and it didn't rely on agricultural cycles or lengthy fermentation. You didn't need pits dug into the ground, complex alkaline solutions using ash and urine, or weeks of careful tending. You could simply buy a powder, dissolve it in water with a few chemicals, and dye vast quantities of fabric in factories. Imagine the traditional dyers working painstakingly with their vats and sticks, suddenly faced with competition from a factory churning out perfect blue fabric in hours for a fraction of the cost. It was a seismic shift. This wasn't just about indigo. It affected the entire natural dye industry globally. Cochineal farmers, madder growers, woad processors, they all faced competition from synthetic alternatives. But for Kano and its indigo pits, which were so deeply integrated into the economy and identity, the impact was profound. The demand for their hand-dyed cloth, especially in the export markets of North Africa, began to decline as cheaper machine-dyed fabric became available. While the quality of traditional Kano indigo might still be superior in terms of depth and fastness for certain applications, the economic reality was undeniable. The arrival of European colonial powers also played a role, not always directly targeting the dye pits, but altering the economic and political structures that supported the trans-Saharan trade. As coastal trade routes gained prominence and European manufactured goods flooded markets, the ancient overland routes faced decline. This further reduced the demand for the high-value commodities like Kano indigo cloth that had traditionally traveled north. Okay, so wait, you're telling me I spent 3 months crossing the desert with this beautiful blue fabric only for people to be like, nah, got this synthetic stuff delivered yesterday. Harsh, man, harsh. So the scale of production in the pits, which had once supplied markets stretching from Kano to Cairo, began to shrink. Fewer people were needed to work the pits. The number of active pits likely decreased over time, and the once booming export trade diminished, focusing more on local or regional markets. The dyeing craft didn't disappear entirely, but its economic dominance certainly waned. Despite these significant challenges, the traditional craft and the pits themselves didn't vanish. They persisted, albeit on a smaller scale. Why? Several reasons. Firstly, local demand for traditionally dyed cloth, especially the deeply colored tuanjaki, remained. This cloth wasn't just about color, it was about cultural significance, quality, and the prestige associated with hand-dyed fabric. For certain ceremonies, important garments, or simply by preference, people still sought out the product of the pits. Secondly, the skill itself was a form of cultural capital. Passing down the knowledge of dyeing, the secrets of the indigo reduction bath, the techniques for achieving specific shades, was part of the heritage of certain families and communities. Even if it wasn't as lucrative as before, maintaining the tradition held value beyond simple economics. It was a connection to the past, a source of identity. Today, the Kofar Mata dye pits in Kano are the most prominent and well-preserved example of this ancient industry. They are no longer the bustling industrial-scale operation that fueled the city's wealth centuries ago, but they are still active. They serve multiple purposes. They are a working craft site, a historical monument, and increasingly a tourist attraction. You can visit the pits, often see dyers at work, though perhaps not on the scale or frequency of their ancestors, and even buy traditionally dyed fabric directly from the source. Watching the process today might feel like stepping back in time, a living echo of the scenes you've imagined. The same deep pits, the same rich blue vats, the same rhythmic dipping and stirring. The sensory experience is still there. The smell, the sight of the evolving color, the feel of the heavy, saturated cloth. But the context has changed. It's less about mass production for export and more about preserving a heritage craft and catering to a market that appreciates its authenticity and history. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is that while the scale of traditional indigo production for export declined dramatically with the advent of synthetic dyes and altered trade routes by the early 20th century, the craft itself survived in places like Kano, adapting to focus on local demand, cultural value, and later tourism. It wasn't an overnight death, but a gradual transformation and reduction in economic significance. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit related to this persistence. Sometimes traditional dyers incorporate modern materials or techniques in subtle ways while still adhering to the core principles of pit dyeing. This might involve using readily available chemicals alongside traditional ingredients or adapting designs to appeal to contemporary tastes or the tourist market. It highlights the dynamic nature of living crafts. They aren't museum pieces frozen in time, but evolve to survive, sometimes blending the old and the new. Imagine explaining to a dyer from the 15th century that you're adding a pinch of something from a plastic bag to his carefully concocted fermentation bath. Don't worry, Grandpa, it just helps. Historians still argue whether the resilience and survival of the kofamata pits into the 21st century is primarily due to intrinsic cultural value and local demand, or whether it owes more to external factors like tourism development and recognition from international bodies like UNESCO, which helps preserve such sites. It's an open scholarly debate. Is the survival driven from within the community or supported from outside? Probably a bit of both, but the weighting is debated. The significance of the Kofar Mata dye pits today extends beyond just being a place where cloth is dyed. They are a tangible link to Kano's illustrious past as a major manufacturing and trading power. They represent centuries of indigenous technological innovation, economic prowess, and artistic skill. Visiting them is to witness a continuous tradition that predates most of the modern world's industrial processes. They stand as a reminder that sophisticated economies and complex manufacturing existed in Africa long before European contact. In 2007, the Kofar Mata pits were included as part of Kano's tentative list for UNESCO World Heritage status, recognizing their outstanding universal value as a surviving example of traditional textile dyeing technology and its role in the Trans-Saharan trade network. This designation brings both recognition and hopefully resources for preservation and support for the remaining artisans. The story of the Kano indigo pits is a microcosm of broader historical themes, the ingenuity of human craftsmanship, the dynamics of global trade and technological change, the impact of external forces like colonialism and globalization, and the resilience of cultural traditions in the face of modernity. From the quiet cultivation of the indigo plant, to the bustling caravans crisscrossing the desert, to the persistent stirrings in the ancient pits. Today, it's a narrative woven with skill, effort, and the enduring allure of a deep, rich blue. As you think about the history steeped in those pits, about the layers of pigment and tradition, the voices of the countless men who dipped and stirred the vastness of the trade routes their product traveled, the day fades further. The scents, the sounds, the images settle. The history isn't just in dusty books, it's in the ground and the colors that still emerge in the techniques that are still practiced. It's a history that whispers, inviting you to listen closely, to feel the weight of the fabric, the warmth of the sun on your back, the coolness of the pit water, the quiet rhythm of the stirring. It's a history that hopefully has lulled you gently towards sleep. Word count 2098. Now dim the lights further, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The light outside has softened completely now. The sounds of the day are fading, replaced by the quieter hum of the night. Or perhaps just the hum of your fan. The images we've explored. The plants swaying in the sun, the smoke rising from the ash fires, the deep, still blue of the pits, the vast expanse of the desert, the markets alive with color. They begin to recede, becoming softer, less defined. Your mind, which has been traveling through time and space, can start to settle. The weight you might have felt imagining the heavy, wet cloth or the long journey of a caravan can lift. The smells of fermentation and wood smoke give way to the clean, neutral air of your own room. There's nowhere else to go, nothing more to see or do tonight. Just this moment, quiet and still. Let the echoes of history, the gentle rhythm of the stirring sticks, the deep, calming color of the indigo fade, like the last light of dusk. Feel your body sink a little deeper, your breathing becomes slower, softer. The stories have been told, the journey is complete. Rest now. Sleep.